Chapter 561, Improvement and Advancement. Nathan surveyed the chakra reserves he'd siphoned from his fallen opponents, and as he'd suspected, the haul was slimmer than he'd hoped. The two chonin had put up almost no resistance, but their reserves were already nearly empty from the earlier clash. Nathan had managed to extract only 10,000 units of chakra from them combined. Yuhua, the special jonin, fared only slightly better. Her strenuous fight and frantic escape had left her stores depleted, so before her final moments, Nathan harvested another 8,000 or so. In all, he'd gained roughly 18,000 chakra. It wasn't a fortune by any stretch, but even a modest sum of chakra could be turned to good use. With a thoughtful nod, Nathan resolved to invest every last drop into two techniques he was determined to master, the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique and the Chakra Feather Cloak. Other skills could wait for another day. He watched impassively as Yuhua's body burned to ash in the aftermath of his extraction. Then, with a quiet exhalation, he formed the seals for Wind Style, Wind Wings. A pale gust of wind swirled around him, lifting him effortlessly into the sky. High above the battlefield, Nathan spread his feather-like chakra wings and set off on his next patrol. The soft rush of air beneath him, a reminder that every small advance brought him one step closer to true strength. Nathan hovered above the moonlit treetops, his senses straining for the next opportunity. With dozens of shadow clones scouting the battlefield, he knew chances wouldn't be in short supply. Sure enough, before long, one clone's signal crackled through his mind. An isolated team of mist shinobi had been detected. Without hesitation, Nathan descended and intercepted them. For 3 days and nights, he'd been locked in this relentless cycle. Send out clones, hunt targets, absorb new combat data, then retreat under cover of darkness to train. Now, on the 4th night, he found himself alone in a dense forest, crouched over a small clearing. The air was cool and still. Only the distant call of an owl marked the passing hours. Drawing a slow breath, Nathan settled into a cross-legged posture. He replayed the Shadow Clone's memories, every clash with those mist ninja, analyzing the timing of their strikes, the rhythm of their chakra flow, the faintest tells in their posture. Each recollection was grist for his practice, a chance to sharpen the skills he'd newly acquired. The mist shinobi had pushed hard over the past days, driving him into constant motion and leaving little time for refinement. He'd seized every patch of quiet, stealing moments whenever the enemy's advance slacked. And yet, without his clones to lighten the load, maintaining perimeter patrols, relaying enemy movements, he wouldn't have managed even the most basic drills. A low hum of chakra rolled through him as he worked to integrate the techniques into muscle memory. His mind raced through hand seals for forbidden jutsu. His arms traced phantom arcs as he synchronized breath with chakra flow. By the end of the session, a sheen of sweat dampened his forehead and limbs trembled from exertion. He let the tension drain out, then surveyed the clearing. His only regret was the drain on his reserves. Each clone, each jutsu, each midnight session had chipped away at his chakra. Restoring it would take time, and the mist forces were still out there, savage and unrelenting. Nathan rose, gathering what energy he could into a single sealed fist. 3 days of skirmishes and midnight training had forged him sharper, and he intended to keep the pressure on. If the mist shinobi thought they could drive him down by sheer numbers, they would soon learn that one determined shinobi could become an entire army of shadows. Because his training window had been cut short, Nathan was forced to spawn more shadow clones to spar simultaneously. Dozens of clones lined up at the same starting point, and with so many bodies sharing the work, their efficiency dipped. And Nathan's chakra reserves drained faster than ever. Even though he could siphon nearly 200,000 chakra points a day from the Mist Ninja, the burn still stung. Over the past 3 days, Nathan had harvested almost 600,000 chakra points from them. 200,000 of those points went toward making up for the 10 days of practice he'd lost when the Mist Ninja's patrols had gone off course. The remaining 400,000 points he devoted entirely to 2 techniques, the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique and the Chakra Feather Garb. He knew the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique granted 1 proficiency point for every 150 chakra expended, while chakra feather garb rewarded 1 point per 100 chakra. By splitting the 400,000 evenly, Nathan pushed his mastery of the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique up by 1,300 points and his chakra feather garb by a full 2,000 points. Nathan watched as his two ninjutsu sprang forward in power. The Earth Style, Hardening Technique, and the Chakra Feather Robe had each leaped from level 1, 12,200 and 3,200 experience respectively, to level 4, 625/2000 and 1,330/2000. At this new tier, both jutsus were far more practical and far more deadly. With these upgrades, Nathan's tactics changed. If he ran into a small squad of mist ninja, he could now barrel straight into their ranks, his defenses bolstered by hardened earth and featherlight chakra, and dispatch them at top speed. If he faced overwhelming numbers, he'd opt for stealth, unleashing the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique to strike from the shadows, sowing chaos and breaking their formation. Then, when his enemies were disoriented, he'd charge in under the double shield of Earth Style and the Chakra Feather Robe to finish the job. Thanks to these enhancements, his ability to plunder chakra had skyrocketed. Even the Mist Ninja had begun to realize that, with Nathan's methods and a few reliable teammates, they could harvest far more chakra each day. Still, Nathan reminded himself not to grow complacent. No matter how strong he'd become, he was by no means invincible. The ninja world Nathan grew up in is only a sliver of the real one. Who knows what powers might exist to bind even someone like him? Take the 4-life seal formation route, unleashed not long ago. If he'd been an ordinary shinobi, that technique would have killed him on the spot. Only his overwhelming strength spared him. So whenever caution is advised, Nathan errs on the side of extreme caution. It's simply not worth risking his life for a handful of chakra. That's why he never picks fights with squads that outnumber him. Even if the chakra payoff would be huge, the danger isn't worth it. But let's return to Nathan in the present. As the hours passed, all the training data and memories imparted by his shadow clones seamlessly integrated into his own mind. Then, in a single moment of clarity, he opened his eyes. A surge of insight washed over him. Focusing every ounce of concentration, Nathan activated his pale, all-seeing eyes and scanned his surroundings. Nathan paused to make sure the forest was empty. Once he was certain no one was watching, he lifted his hands and crossed them into the distinctive hand seal. With a sharp exhale, he invoked his technique, no longer simply a shadow clone jutsu, but the newly refined multiple shadow clone technique. In an instant, a cloud of violet-charged chakra smoke billowed around him. When it cleared, 200, maybe 300, clones of Nathan stood arrayed throughout the glade, each one a perfect copy of the real him. Every branch above, every rock at his feet, even the shafts of sunlight breaking through the canopy, seemed alive with motion as the clones tensed, ready for orders. For 3 days straight, he had honed his shadow clone technique, gathering the final few hundred proficiency points he needed. And now, at last, he'd reached level 7. As he felt the surge of power settle in his limbs, he understood the breakthrough. This was still fundamentally the same shadow clone technique he'd learned long ago. The difference lay in how chakra was dispersed. Instead of a gradual flow to each clone, his chakra burst outward in a single, intense pulse, dividing his energy into hundreds of fragments in the space of a heartbeat. It had taken every ounce of control he possessed to direct that explosive burst without losing himself in the swirl of chakra. But the payoff was undeniable. Standing at the center of his army of shadows, Nathan felt his reserves brimming with potential, as if he could challenge the very limits of his power. Nathan knew the danger all too well. Any shinobi whose chakra reserve isn't large enough risks being completely drained in an instant by this forbidden jutsu, an outcome that spelled certain death, much like those unfortunate souls whose life forces were leached away by Nathan himself. It was precisely for that reason that the second Hokage, Senju Tobirama, had classified it as a forbidden technique. Still, with his current chakra pool hovering around 140,000, nearly 150,000, Nathan felt confident he could pull it off. He formed the hand seals and reached out, sensing the chakra flowing through his body. The feeling was eerily similar to that of his shadow clones, though markedly less stable. After all, each clone carried only a few hundred chakra points. Their existence was always precarious. Worse yet, when his shadow clone technique had evolved into the multiple shadow clone technique, it inherited a crippling drawback. Even if he dispelled all the clones immediately and reclaimed their chakra, he still lost 5 chakra points per clone. Back when he first discovered that quirk, it had pained him to watch his reserves tick downward so rapidly. Now, standing on the brink of attempting the forbidden jutsu, he could almost feel the sting of that inevitable loss, and he could ill afford any mistakes. Nathan steadied himself, heart-pounding, and prepared to unleash the very power Tobirama had deemed too dangerous for common use. Nathan realized that the more shadow clones he created, the thinner his own chakra supply became. Each time he unleashed the multi-shadow clone technique, it drained at least 5% of his current chakra. From now on, he'd have to restrict the number of clones he made, otherwise the cost would balloon beyond anything he'd imagined. Of course, if he ever reached a point where chakra was no longer a limited resource, he could toss restraint aside entirely. Chapter 562, Perfection and Arrangement. Night draped the forest in shadows, but Nathan hardly noticed. He'd grown accustomed to testing the multiple shadow clone technique, though he knew its true strength would only emerge when his chakra reserves were limitless. For now, the standard shadow clone technique served him best, economical and reliable. With that in mind, Nathan formed a hand seal and summoned a dozen or more shadow clones. Each wavered into existence beside him, ready to train. Tonight's session wouldn't focus solely on cloning. He also aimed to advance another jutsu to its next rank. A short distance away, one clone stood before a towering tree. Hands weaving a precise sequence of seals, the clone drew in a steady breath. Without physical contact, orange flames curled up the bark, transforming the trunk into a pillar of smoke and embers. This was the fire style, Sushoku technique. Over 10 days ago, Nathan had brought this fire style to level 6. Its experience gauge read 5,125 out of 10,000. After a week and a half of rigorous practice, it was now on the cusp of promotion. Nathan watched the clones display with satisfaction. Soon, this fiery ninjutsu would be even more potent. All around him, other clones executed their own drills, chakra control, weapon techniques, stealth maneuvers, each task designed to refine Nathan's skills while conserving his energy. As the flames danced and the forest darkened further, Nathan felt a thrill of anticipation. By dawn, he intended to emerge with 2 new breakthroughs, a mastery of his shadow clones and a perfected fire style, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Once he's promoted, Nathan will gain an extra 40,000 chakra points every day. He can funnel that surplus into his other abilities, dramatically accelerating their progress, which is exactly why he's so eager. Based on his current proficiency, though, it'll still be some time before he reaches that rank. Pushing the thought aside for now, Nathan turned his full attention back to the reflection heart technique, determined to evolve his Sharingan. Unlike the palm fairy technique, which he could practice anywhere and at any hour, the reflection heart technique demanded strict conditions. Above all, a quiet, uninterrupted space. To juggle both disciplines without burning out, Nathan reorganized his training schedule. Daylight hours would be devoted entirely to the palm fairy technique, while nighttime would belong to the reflection heart. Repetition was boring, and the long hours felt endless, but Nathan forced himself to endure. He wouldn't let monotony stand in the way of his daily training goals. Nathan sat in quiet contemplation, staring at the floating readout before him. 19,856/50,000. Over 10 days had passed since he first unlocked his Sharingan's evolution, and the progress bar was finally nearing the critical 20,000 mark. According to his calculations, shattering that barrier would trigger a passive feedback to his spiritual attribute, automatically elevating his core capabilities, speed, strength, perception, all of which would surge in unison. Such a transformation could redefine every aspect of his combat potential. Knowing this, he resolved to prepare himself both mentally and physically for the breakthrough. His thoughts drifted to the creature he hoped would accompany this next stage of growth, his Susanoo. Once the Sharingan's evolution surpasses 20,000, the spectral warrior should enter its second phase, sprouting luminous meridians, coalescing flesh, and finally condensing into a full chakra armor. The defensive properties alone would be staggering, but the true prize lay in the Susanu's signature long-range assault, the Yasaka Magatama. Rumor had it that this technique wielded power on par with an A-rank ninjutsu, and Nathan couldn't help but anticipate the moment he'd claim it as his own. Of course, he reminded himself, there was a difference between possessing a trump card and being able to play it. In his current state, he simply lacked the strength to manifest the Susanu. Yet no, owing it awaited him. Knowing that this latent force would soon be within reach, stirred a quiet excitement in his chest. The stronger his Susanoo became, the more decisive his advantage would be. With that certainty burning bright, Nathan bent his focus back to training, determined to ensure that when the evolution finally clicked past 20,000, he'd be ready to wield every ounce of its power. Even if he can't use it right now, that doesn't mean it'll stay off limits forever. Once Nathan perfects his Susanoo, shaping it into that legendary form capable of shattering mountains and cracking the earth, he'll unleash it, no questions asked. Slurp. Wiping the corners of his mouth, Nathan shook himself back into focus and dove into his training with renewed determination. There was no point fretting over the complete Susanoo yet. Even reaching Susanoo's second stage would take about 3 more days. Instead, he set his sights on mastering the basics. Every 30 to 60 minutes, he recalled his shadow clones to absorb their experiences and memories, then sent them back out to train under his reflection heart technique. Before long, night had fallen. After one final recall and mental integration, something clicked. Nathan's eyes snapped open, a bright spark of insight igniting inside him. He lifted his hands, forming a simple yin seal. With a crackle of heat, the large tree before him erupted into flames. Proof that his fire style, Susho no Jutsu, had just leveled up. Nathan had already achieved the perfected state of his fire chakra, which meant he needed only a single hand seal to unleash fire-style Susho no Jutsu. The result was astonishing speed, so swift that any chunin caught in its path wouldn't survive a single exchange, and even jonin would have to be on constant guard. The only drawback was its single-target nature. Nathan could only channel its destructive power at one opponent at a time, making it less useful against a crowd. Still, he was more than satisfied. His mastery of other fire-style techniques and a handful of complementary jutsu easily covered the gap. With fire-style, Susho no Jutsu now second nature, Nathan turned his attention to reallocating the 40,000 chakra points he had originally devoted to perfecting that one move. He opened his chakra panel and flicked through his skills list. After a moment's consideration, he directed every freed point into his wind-style repertoire, specifically bolstering Rasen Shuriken, much like he had with wind-style, Wind Wings. With his elemental arsenal thus balanced, Nathan's next opponents, be they lone rivals or entire squads, would have no easy targets left. 3 days after mastering wind-style Wind Wings, Nathan poured the 20,000 chakra he'd been saving directly into refining his wind-style, Rasen Shuriken. He'd shelved that training 2 months ago to develop his Earth release, leaving his proficiency frozen at level 7, 8,200 and 20,000. Now, with his chakra reserves replenished, he was ready to pick it up again. Wind-style Rasen Shuriken was an S-rank forbidden technique, Nathan's most powerful weapon in reserve. His ultimate goal was to perfect it so completely that he could unleash the attack without any hand seals, giving him an unmatched advantage in combat. But he knew mastery wouldn't come quickly. Even if he channeled the daily chakra savings from Fire-style, Flame Shield, and Wind-style, Wind Wings, about 60,000 points in total, he could only gain roughly 400 proficiency points per day. And with A-rank ninjutsu capped at level 9, and S-rank assumed higher still, Nathan's current position, level 7 at 8,200 out of 20,000, meant he was still more than halfway from level 8, let alone the levels beyond. The road to true perfection lay long ahead. Nathan knew that no matter how tough things got, he couldn't give up. You can't live in the moment alone, and basic, low-level ninjutsu would no longer carry him forward. Aside from lightning style, he had already mastered every other technique thoroughly. Adding 1 or 2 more skills wouldn't make much difference, but perfecting the wind-style Rasen Shuriken would be a game-changer. The gap between these two paths was clear, and his choice was obvious. Dedicate himself to mastering the Rasen Shuriken as soon as possible. Chapter 563, Emergency. 3 days slipped by in a blur. As the final negotiations between Konohakure and Iwagakure drew near, Kirigakure's assaults grew more frenzied than ever. Almost every Konoha outpost along the eastern border of the Land of Fire was now engulfed in the flames of war, and several had already fallen. Desperate to shore up defenses, Narakemitsu tore down sections of the eastern wall to reinforce the western ramparts, endlessly shuttling troops between strongholds in a bid to halt the Mist Village's advance. Until today, none of this turmoil had directly involved Nathan. After all, the Blackstone stronghold where he was stationed lay just 3 miles from Feiyu Town, one of Hidden Mist's 4 major invasion points, but its strategic position meant reinforcements rarely moved through it. Yet that changed this morning. Nathan had been sweeping the nearby battlefield, scouting enemy positions and gathering intelligence when a sudden summons came from Sano Nobuhisa. He was ordered to return to Blackstone immediately. Though Nathan wondered what crisis could have erupted in a stronghold thought to be safe from the front lines, he gave no second thought to disobeying. Spreading his arms, he leapt into the air and raced back toward the looming walls of Blackstone, bracing himself for whatever emergency awaited within. When Nathan returned, he realized it wasn't Sano Nobuhisa who had requested his presence, but Nara Keimitsu. An urgent order had arrived, demanding he hurry at once to the southern headquarters. No details, only that an important mission awaited him. Recognizing the urgency, Nathan didn't hesitate. After restocking his gear and supplies at the Blackstone stronghold, he activated his wind escape, wind wings, and soared into the sky, setting a direct course for headquarters. Normally, the journey would take half a day by standard travel, but at full speed, Nathan covered the distance in under 10 minutes. Once his identity was confirmed at the gates, he stepped into the conference room and immediately realized he wasn't alone. A handful of jonin had been summoned as well, among them a familiar face, Uchiha Shisui. Ever since Shisui had arrived at Atsuzu Port, he'd remained under Keimitsu's command without once leaving his side. Now, as they all gathered, Nathan wondered what task could be so pressing that it required this select assembly of elite shinobi. Nathan was grateful that this turn of events had foiled Danzo's scheme last time. Still, he wondered, if his allies had been by his side then, would Danzo have dared to set such a trap? Perhaps not, but he might simply dispatch an even stronger force to hunt them down. Shaking his head, Nathan banished the thought. There was no use in dwelling on what-ifs. He stepped forward, nodded respectfully to Uchiha Shisui, exchanged a brief greeting, and took the seat beside him. Paying no mind to the curious glances around him, Nathan quietly activated the Palm Immortal technique, drawing chakra throughout his limbs to harden his body like tempered steel. Ideally, he'd spend this idle time practicing the art of reflecting the heart. According to his calculations, his Sharingan was on the verge of breaking past the 20,000, 50,000 evolution mark today. But the reflecting heart technique demanded absolute solitude and silence, luxuries this gathering simply couldn't provide. Reluctantly, he set the idea aside. Minutes crept by, and a quarter of an hour passed. Narakemitsu stepped into the conference room, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. But the moment he lifted his head, a spark of determination struck his tired features. He let out a sharp, commanding, "Everyone!" and the assembled officers snapped to attention. "I've called you here on short notice because there's a critical mission before us," he announced, his voice steady despite the strain on his face. The room fell deathly silent as every pair of eyes fixed on him, waiting. Instead of diving into details, Kimitsu paused to draw a deep breath. Then, in a low, grave tone, he said, "Not long ago, the mangrove stronghold fell." A chorus of startled murmurs broke out. Officers exchanged horrified glances. Even Nathan felt a jolt of disbelief run through him. He'd spent months on this front and knew the layout of every defensive position like the back of his hand. The mangrove stronghold wasn't the most formidable fortress. At best, it occupied a secondary line of defense along the eastern perimeter, but its political and strategic importance was anything but minor. It served as the gateway to Damning Mansion, the region's administrative heart. Silence reclaimed the room as the weight of Kimitsu's words sank in. All knew that losing Mangrove Stronghold wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a blow that could undermine their entire command structure. Now, they faced the daunting task of retaking it before the enemy could exploit its position and bring Damning Mansion to its knees. The fall of Mangrove Stronghold means the Mist Ninja can strike straight at the heart of the Fire Country and seize glory for themselves. Though the daimyo's position in Konoha's hierarchy is largely ceremonial, outward respect must still be maintained. For that very reason, Konoha has garrisoned the fortress with hundreds of shinobi for the past 2 or 3 years, making its defenses stronger than many frontline bastions. Now, Nara Keiko has just announced its downfall. Naturally, the entire council is stunned into silence. After a long pause, someone at the back clears his throat and finally speaks up. "Captain, how did Mangrove Stronghold fall? Last I heard, Kirigakure didn't send nearly enough troops to overwhelm it." Heads nod around the table. Whispers break out in small clusters. Keiko raises a hand to still the chatter, then clears his throat once more. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he begins gravely. "I called this meeting because the situation is worse than we first believed." Chapter X, The Vulpix Gambit. Nathan sat stiffly in the high-ceilinged conference hall of Konoha's hidden summit chambers. Around him, the village's top shinobi and advisors had gathered to hear the latest intelligence from their scouts. The tension in the room was palpable. A scout, face drawn with disbelief, stepped forward. "According to our most recent reports, Kirigakure has deployed a Vulpix near the Land of Fire's border." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Narashikamaru frowned, fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. "They've unleashed a Vulpix? What are they planning? Another full-scale war?" Before anyone could reply, Danzo Uchiha's cold voice cut across the table. "It's nothing less than an act of aggression. They've just tossed a tactical bomb into the chamber." Shikamaru pinched the bridge of his nose. "The Fourth Ninja War may be winding down, but this," he gestured toward Danzo, "is a stark reminder that it's not over until every faction has played their final card. Deploying a Vulpix now is like launching a nuclear strike before the ceasefire is even in place." Nathan leaned forward. "If we do nothing," he said quietly, "our people will lose faith in our leadership, and any peace talks that come after will be doomed before they start." Across the table, an older advisor spoke up, his voice measured. "Yet if we retaliate, we risk igniting full-scale hostilities. All the groundwork we've laid for harmony could be shattered overnight." A heavy silence settled. Konoha's leadership was divided into 2 camps: the pro-war faction, led by Danzo, who demanded a swift and forceful response, and the peace faction, which urged caution, hoping to resolve the matter diplomatically. Nathan looked from Danzo's steely gaze to the weary faces of the peace advocates. He realized that whichever path they chose would shape the future of the shinobi world, and that he would soon be forced to take a stand. Outside, evening light filtered through the latticed windows, casting long shadows over the chamber floor. Inside, Konoha's fate hung in the balance, teetering between the promise of peace and the lure of power. And at the heart of it all was a single unexpected weapon, a Vulpix. 2 opposing factions had emerged within the village leadership. One argued that only a display of overwhelming power, using the Ninetales Jinchuriki, could teach Kirigakure a lesson for their recent arrogance. The other, the pro-peace camp led by 3rd Hokage Hiruzen Sarutobi, believed in de-escalation, make every battle smaller, resolve disputes quickly, and bring the war to an end as soon as possible. It was no secret that Narakiku belonged to Sarutobi's peace faction, and most of the strategists gathered in the council chamber stood with her. Even Nathan, long known for his non-confrontational approach on the battlefield, found himself counted among the pacifists, though he didn't consider himself a true pacifist. Narakiku rose, her expression calm but resolute, and swept her gaze across the room. "Your mission this time is critical," she announced. "The Third has ordered us to reorganize our forces and retake the Red Tree base immediately." A murmur rose among the advisors, quickly crystallizing into pointed questions. "Reorganize our forces? Are there any shinobi left alive at the Red Tree base? What about the Six-Tails Beast? Did it survive the assault? Narakiku raised a hand, calling for silence. Then she spoke, answering the first question with practiced clarity. Kirigakure's attack was sudden, but the Six Tails rampaged indiscriminately. Even their own ninjas feared to approach the beast's path of destruction. As a result, most of our operatives managed to slip away before the base was fully overrun. She paused, letting her words sink in. That leaves us with a handful of hidden survivors and damaged defenses, but also an opportunity. We'll assemble a rapid response team tonight. Nathan, she looked directly at him. Mren, I want you to lead the reconnaissance detail, find out exactly who's still holding out, and secure any reinforcements we can muster. Nathan inclined his head, already calculating the challenges ahead. Understood. I'll depart at once. Narakiku's stern eyes softened only slightly. Good. The fate of the Red Tree base could tip the balance in our favor. Let's move quickly and quietly. As the council dissolved into plans and preparations, Nathan gathered his gear, determination burning in his chest. The night would be long and the mission dangerous, but failure was not an option. Although the Red Cedar base has fallen, many Konoha shinobi survived the attack. Now they're mustering every ounce of strength to slow down the advancing Kirigakure forces. Nathan listened carefully and nodded to himself. It made perfect sense. Yugo, the Six Tails Jinchuriki, was still just a child and had no hope of controlling the tailed beast's power. Kirigakure would almost certainly use him as a weapon, unleashing the Six Tails upon Konoha's defenses. In that scenario, the smart and well-prepared Konoha shinobi at Red Cedar Base could still turn the tide and survive. Before Nathan could voice any further worries, Nara Kigwang answered his unspoken question. Don't worry, he said confidently. We've already assigned someone to handle the Six Tails. You don't need to know who it is just yet. You'll meet them when you arrive. Whispers rippled through the group as everyone mulled over the possibilities. Nathan, however, needed no guesses. There was only one shinobi with the skill and the reputation to face down a tailed beast, Minato Namikaze. Nathan's urgency wasn't only driven by the fact that the enemy was powerful enough to handle the Six Tails. It was also because his wife, Kushina Uzumaki, housed the Nine Tails. Now the war faction in the village was demanding that they use the Nine Tails Jinchuriki to strike back at the Hidden Mist village. If Nathan didn't want Kushina dragged into mortal danger, he had to resolve this crisis quickly, before it did irreparable damage to Konoha's political balance. Successful intervention would quiet Danzo and his supporters, granting Hokage Hiruzen Sarutobi the breathing room he desperately needed. If Nathan failed, Kushina would inevitably be forced into the mission herself. Nathan couldn't help but wonder if this very scenario had already played out in some parallel timeline. If it had, Minato Namikaze must have found a way to solve it flawlessly. If it hadn't, well, there was no time to lament what-ifs. The Hidden Mist village had just released the Six Tails from its restraints, unleashing indiscriminate havoc. Though this move certainly maximized the beast's destructive power, it also handed Minato Namikaze, and by extension Nathan, an unexpected advantage. Now it was up to them to seize it. Nathan let out a relieved breath as he pieced it all together. No matter how long the tailed beasts had lain imprisoned, minds poisoned by decades of hatred and tyrannical will, they stood no chance against the wisdom and valor of Minato Namikaze. Especially given Minato's unparalleled skill in sealing techniques, any accident was all but impossible. What had seemed urgent at first now felt manageable. As that realization sank in, Nathan's tense expression relaxed. He barely had time to settle before Nara Chiguang called him over and outlined his orders. The primary objective was straightforward: leverage Nathan's ability to fly, penetrate the enemy lines ahead of the main force, and gather critical battlefield intelligence. He was to relay every scrap of information to the senior shinobi accompanying him, allowing them to craft precise countermeasures. On top of that, Nara Chiguang tasked him with a secondary, but no less vital mission. If Vulpix appeared or threatened to break free, Nathan was to assist in containing or neutralizing the beast. With everything clear, Nathan nodded, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He would soar into the fray, eyes sharp, ready to report back the moment he uncovered anything of use. Chapter 564, Arrival and Tragedy. Your next assignment is to assist with the tailed beasts. When the order rang out, the assembled shinobi exchanged worried glances in the direction of Nathan. They all knew what a tailed beast represented, an elemental force of destruction, far beyond any ordinary threat. Sure, as elite ninja they feared less than civilians did, but they were all too aware of the yawning power gap between even the strongest shinobi and a tailed beast. This mission was as dangerous as it got. Why, then, had Narachiguang singled out Nathan? They'd heard the stories of Nathan's prowess, and some had even witnessed it in battle. He was undoubtedly strong, but not so overwhelmingly so, that he could face down a tailed beast on sheer power alone. No one believed Chiguang would recklessly send him to his doom. There had to be a reason, something hidden, extraordinary. Perhaps Nathan's rumored ability to fly made the difference? Several Konoha shinobi exchanged murmurs, their voices a mixture of doubt and guarded hope. Whatever the truth, it was clear that Nathan was being entrusted with a task that would test every ounce of his skill and courage. If Nathan could fly, he'd be far safer against the tailed beasts, and he could even draw their attention away from the others. That made him the ideal choice for a support role. That should do it, Narachiguang concluded. Several Konoha jonin nodded in agreement, convinced they understood Chiguang's reasoning. But Uchiha Shisui wasn't so certain. Every time he faced Nathan, he felt a subtle pressing weight. Although Shisui's own powers had improved dramatically, he still had no confidence in defeating Nathan. There was something unfathomable about him, a depth Shisui couldn't quite gauge. That instinctive respect gave Nathan an edge in Shisui's mind. Shisui suspected there was more to Chiguang's decision than simply Nathan's ability to fly. His hunch proved correct. After Nathan confided in him about the ambush he'd survived on a previous mission, Chiguang quietly investigated the incident. The results confirmed Shisui's suspicions. Nathan's true strength was far more complex and formidable than anyone had realized. Nathan had anticipated the possibility, which is why he'd been stationed at Yujin Port during the decapitation operation, to keep the mist shinobi from calling in reinforcements. But this latest intelligence confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Nathan's true abilities far exceed initial estimates. That's also why Hiruzen Sarutobi assigned him to aid Minato Namikaze this time, an extra layer of security. As a devoted member of the peace faction, Nathan genuinely wants the war to end, and he's determined to carry out the Hokage's orders with everything he's got. Nathan doesn't concern himself with what others think, and when he received this new mission, he wasn't surprised. He was thrilled. The moment he learned a six-tailed beast had appeared at the Red Tree base, he vowed to make contact. Not to seize the creature, that would be ideal, of course, but simply to establish a connection. His current power isn't enough to fully subdue such a formidable tailed beast. True, if he activated his Mangekyo Sharingan, he could dominate the six-tail with little trouble. But without the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, he can't sustain that power for long. Despite that limitation, Nathan's resolve only hardened. He would do whatever it took, short of overtaxing his eyes, to bring this mission to a successful conclusion and help usher in the peace he so desperately wants. Nathan realized that even his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan couldn't shoulder such an immense chakra drain forever. He had no choice but to fall back on sealing techniques, but apart from the Guardian Seal and the Sealing Array, he knew of no other seals capable of binding the tailed beasts, nor could he force them into submission. In other words, outright capturing a beast was beyond him for now. So why had he insisted on making contact? The answer was straightforward. He needed to test whether his level 6 chakra absorption technique would actually draw chakra from a tailed beast. His true aim wasn't to bolster his fighting force, but to secure a steady, reliable source of chakra. If he managed to imprison a tailed beast, yet found himself unable to siphon its energy, the outcome would be laughable. A preliminary trial was essential. Originally, Nathan planned to use shadow clones and the transformation technique to conceal his appearance during the experiment. But thanks to Narakiku's careful orchestration, no one would bat an eye, even if he deliberately approached the six tails in person. With her backing, he could proceed openly and finally discover whether his absorption jutsu lived up to its promise. Nathan couldn't help but grin. Danger? Truth be told, he wasn't losing a moment's sleep over it. with the Uchiha clan's Sharingan dampening the tailed beast's power and his own lightning-fast wind wings technique to keep him out of harm's way. Most threats were already neutralized. And if things ever got truly dire, he still had the legendary Heaven's Guard as his ultimate trump card. No shinobi in the world could stand against it. In short, Nathan felt completely secure. The meeting ended just as swiftly as it had begun. After exchanging quick farewells with his teammates, Nathan leapt into the air, weaving his chakra into wind-style, wind wings. In moments, he was soaring high above the clouds, heading straight for the mangrove stronghold. Below him, a vast tangle of mangrove trees gave way to a wide, straight road. On either end of that road stood the twin gates, east and west, guarding a modest city known as the Red Tree Stronghold. Now, though, the once proud fortress lay in ruins. Charred timbers and shattered walls framed silent streets, and faint wisps of smoke still curled into the sky, the only reminder of the destruction that had passed through. Obviously, the Six Tails had only just departed. Nathan closed his eyes and tuned his senses to the air, detecting a faint but unmistakable weight of residue chakra. That lingering oppression was the beast's own energy, still clinging to the atmosphere. Chakra, after all, is born from the fusion of spiritual and physical energy, which gives it a living quality. Everyone's mental state colors their chakra, too. When Orochimaru's soul was sealed into his arms and he turned to Tsunade for healing, Kabuto Yakushi could sense the distortion in their chakra signatures. The Hyuga clan's Byakugan lets them peer into an opponent's thoughts by reading subtle shifts in chakra. All these abilities rely on the same principle. Tailed beasts are no different, only their chakra is far heavier, and, over centuries of imprisonment by humans, it has grown twisted with hatred. Perhaps their energy was once more benign, but the endless cycle of capture and banishment bred a violent resentment. Nathan felt that change at once. The Six Tails chakra was darker, more oppressive than any human's. He couldn't mistake it. Without hesitation, Nathan opened his eyes and surged forward, trusting his instincts. As he flew, a muffled explosion sounded to his right. Having fought for years on the battlefield, he recognized at once the crackle of a detonating talisman. He didn't pause. Raising his hand, he released the guardian seal carved between his brows. His vision flared white as he activated his enhanced sight, instantly revealing everything within a 1-kilometer radius. He zeroed in on the source of the blast. Below, he spotted a fierce skirmish. Nearly 100 shinobi from Konoha were locked in combat with an equally large force from Kirigakure. Nathan's heart tightened. These had to be the Konoha survivors Nara Chiguang had told him about, those who'd escaped the tailed beast's assault on the Red Tree Stronghold. Yet something didn't add up. "This number seems off," he murmured. Nathan widened his gaze, determined to uncover what he'd missed. Nathan crested a low rise and froze. About 200 or 300 meters ahead lay another battlefield, this one far smaller than he'd expected. Fewer than 150 shinobi in total, both sides combined. Nara Chiguang had promised a far larger force. At first, Nathan couldn't square the numbers. Then, as he studied the melee, the truth became clear. Though Kirigakure had dispatched fewer warriors, their team was markedly superior. Not a single genin among them. Every last man was at least a chunin, many far above that rank. By contrast, the handful of Konoha reinforcements stationed here at the Red Tree Fortress were of middling skill. As a second-line garrison, they'd been deemed less critical, and nearly a third were still genin. Worse, they'd already weathered the tailed beast's surprise assault. Scattered bodies lay across the field, more Konoha casualties than Kirigakure. Even so, the defenders clung to their formation, refusing to break. That stubborn resilience, given their losses and inexperience, struck Nathan as extraordinary. He ducked behind cover, heart pounding. If this handful of shinobi could hold out against formidable opponents and a tailed beast ambush, then the scale of the war ahead would be far greater and more brutal than he'd ever imagined. Nathan hovered in midair, watching the battlefield below. After several tense minutes, long enough to confirm that both the defenders and the attackers could at least hold their ground, he sealed his Byakugan with the Guardian Seal once more. Since both sides included Hyuga shinobi, he had no intention of risking detection. Sealing the white eyes was simply the safest choice. With his dojutsu safely hidden, He turned on his heels and retraced his path, flying swiftly but silently through the sky. A few minutes later, he sensed the situation had stabilized enough for him to withdraw momentarily. Nathan came to a stop at the edge of his patrol range, then activated his heart-to-heart technique to reach out to his teammates trailing behind. He relayed every detail he'd observed and instructed them to prepare for immediate deployment. Once the connection ended, Nathan pivoted back toward the skirmish, determined to buy time until his reinforcements arrived. He scanned the horizon and caught the faint, steady presence of the distant Vulpix. So what, he thought. His mission here was support, not a headlong attack. There was no advantage in rushing off to chase a single Pokémon. First, he had to neutralize the pressing threat before him. Everything else could wait. Driven by that resolve, Nathan spread his wings, gathered speed, and plunged back into the heart of the battle. Chapter 565, Delay. A few minutes later, Nathan swept back over the battlefield. This time he made no attempt at stealth. He flew in full view, high above the combatants. There's someone in the sky. A mist ninja was the first to spot him, his shout cutting through the din. Watch out, it's Ghost Sword Nathan, another voice called out. The name spread instantly through the mist ranks, and every shinobi on the field turned upward, faces etched with fear, curiosity, and even a trace of defiance. The Konoha ninjas, sensing the sudden shift among their opponents, followed their gaze. Unlike the Mist Warriors, who now seemed rattled by Nathan's reputation, the Leaf Shinobi felt a surge of hope. Rumors of the Konoha Gemini, the pair of elite jonin, had reached even the most remote outposts. They'd been under relentless pressure for days, their endurance stretched to the limit. If a single genin had arrived, it would have been a relief. The arrival of a seasoned jonin like Nathan, however, felt like an outright rescue. For the first time since the battle began, they allowed themselves to breathe. Nathan's presence overhead was more than a symbol. It was a promise that reinforcements had arrived, and with them, the chance to turn the tide. Nathan's arrival sparked a flicker of hope among the Konoha shinobi. With reinforcements nowhere in sight, their morale had been teetering on the brink of collapse. But knowing Nathan was here steadied their nerves. Even before he'd made his move, his presence alone bought them precious minutes. Perched high above the battlefield, Nathan surveyed the anxious faces below. Without a word, he dove. Cutting through the air, he dropped altitude rapidly and released a lone shuriken. The Mist Ninja contingent gaped in astonishment. They'd been bracing for a massive jutsu or an all-out assault. Instead, this was it? Their taut nerves had been wound up for nothing. Over on the Konoha side, brows furrowed in confusion. Just one shuriken? They wondered. Why not more? In that moment of disbelief, Nathan's hand shot up. His fingers blurred as he formed the 8-hand seals, Cho, Shu, Chen, Su, Hai, Si, Yin, and activated the shuriken shadow clone technique. In an instant, dozens of identical Nathans burst into existence, each hurling shuriken after shuriken toward the stunned Mist Ninja ranks. The next instant, the single shuriken Nathan hurled fractured into shadows. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of steel blades hovered in the air. It was the first time Nathan had unleashed this technique before such a large crowd. He had no qualms about Sarutobi Hiruzen witnessing it. After all, Hiruzen had originated the basic method, but Nathan's version was an evolution built on the shadow clone technique, raised to its utmost expression, the multiple shadow clone technique. If anyone accused him of simply copying, they'd only marvel at his talent rather than call him a plagiarist. Besides, Hiruzen was known for his kindness and eagerness to nurture young shinobi. If he noticed, he would likely offer praise, not condemnation. Down below, both ally and enemy shinobi watched in growing alarm as the sky darkened with spinning shuriken. Instinctively, they scattered, each warrior desperate to avoid the deadly hailstorm hurtling toward them. Nathan hovered above the fray, observing the chaos below. It didn't take long before the Konoha shinobi realized something peculiar. Every shuriken hurled through the air seemed to pass them by, striking only the Mist Ninja. That was no accident. 3 days ago, Nathan wouldn't have been able to pull off such precision, but since then he had siphoned in an extra 600,000 chakra points. He'd split them evenly, investing 300,000 into his shuriken shadow clone technique and 300,000 into his chakra feather robe. Those massive infusions propelled both skills from level 4 to level 5, an enormous hurdle to clear. His shadow clone technique's progress jumped from 625 2,000 to 625 5,000, while the feather robe soared from 1 through 32,000 to 2,335,000. Achieving level 5 wasn't just about numbers, it represented a qualitative shift. Nathan's control over each clone's flight path sharpened dramatically, allowing him to single out enemy targets with uncanny accuracy. From his lofty vantage point, he could track every shinobi on the battlefield. With a thought, he directed his spectral shurikens to weave through the defenders of Konoha and home in exclusively on the mist operatives. Though the display looked spectacular, arcs of shining chakra carving lethal trajectories, it was more a psychological strike than a truly devastating assault. Nathan's real power lay in the precision of his control, not sheer brutality. Since he hadn't launched a sneak attack this time, the mist ninjas below, each at least Chunin rank, weren't going to be cut down by a few shuriken. Still, Nathan's strike shattered their rhythm, buying the Konoha shinobi beneath a precious moment to steady themselves. And that was only his opening move. High above the battlefield, Nathan formed the seals for a shuriken shadow clone technique. No sooner had the duplicate appeared than he rocketed back upward, narrowly evading a volley of kunai and water arrows. Spotting an opening, he plunged earthward once more, this dive even swifter than before. At just the right distance, he locked both hands into seals and unleashed his next jutsu, fire style, Phoenix Fire Technique. Puff, 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 a trio of blazing spheres burst from his mouth like gunfire, streaking toward the clustered mist ninjas below. If they'd managed to block shuriken, now they'd have to scramble to dodge these incendiary shots. They could counter with ninjutsu, of course, but with these fireballs bearing down, any return attack would be a risky gamble. Nathan unleashed a barrage of hundreds of fireballs in an instant. Had the mist shinobi tried to absorb each one with ninjutsu, they would have drained their chakra reserves completely. Instead, they chose to dodge, and their evasions handed the nearby Konoha fighters a golden opportunity. Some used the moment to replenish their chakra and recover, while others sprang a surprise counterattack. In a flash, the tide of battle shifted. They were no longer pinned to the defense. This was exactly Nathan's plan. He never intended to annihilate the mist shinobi, only to stall them. A handful of sharp-eyed enemies saw through his ruse, but acknowledging a strategy is one thing, stopping it is another. They dispatched squad after squad to surround and overwhelm him. Yet Nathan, having perfected wind style, wind wings, skated through the air with such blistering speed and agility that none could touch him. Still, he deliberately held back. His aim wasn't to shatter the enemy ranks outright, but simply to hold them at bay, buying precious time for his comrades to regroup and counterattack. Nathan's strategy was simple, hit and run. As soon as he saw the Konoha shinobi recover their bearings, he'd dart off to another skirmish and strike there. The moment those fighters paused to catch their breath, he'd swoop back and unleash the same assault here. In short, his plan boiled down to one word: delay. Chapter 5566. Join time crawled by, minute after minute, until an hour had slipped past. Nathan had carefully controlled the pace, keeping the mist shinobi engaged and preventing them from losing heart. Yet after so long with no decisive move, their patience was fraying. Some were already whispering about a retreat, something Nathan could not allow. Thankfully, he'd stalled them just long enough. Uchiha Shisui and the rest of Konoha's reinforcements were closing in, so the threat of the mist forces slipping away had evaporated. At worst, he could dispatch 2 squads to flank and overwhelm any stragglers. But to his surprise, the mist shinobi refused to break. Though shaken, they held their ground, and in doing so, they squandered their last real chance to escape cleanly. As Shisui and the others arrived on the perimeter, Nathan activated his Sharingan. Through its crimson lens, he watched the mist troops fall into panic, eyes wide with disbelief. They clearly hadn't expected Konoha's backup to reach them so swiftly. Though Uchiha Shisui's team numbered scarcely more than a handful, each member was a seasoned jonin, a presence far more daunting than dozens or even hundreds of mid-level shinobi. True, they'd raced here with barely a moment's rest, burning through chakra and stamina to arrive as quickly as possible. But Jonin-level prowess still outstrips average mid-tier fighters by a wide margin. For weeks, Konoha's forces had been locked in a brutal stalemate around the Red Tree Fortress. Their struggle had never been for lack of high-end talent. Nathan's earlier arrival had already bolstered their front lines, easing much of the pressure. Now, with Shisui and his comrades joining the fray, every gap in their defenses was filled, and their confidence soared. It was no wonder the Mist Shinobi began to falter. Across the battlefield, Shisui's group sprang into action without a word of hesitation, cutting straight toward the enemy's strongest operatives. At the sight of Konoha's elite Jonin charging headlong into the mist ranks, every Konoha shinobi felt their spirits lift. They rallied at once, surging forward to reclaim the field. Above them, the sky crackled with unleashed chakra, heralding the turning tide of battle. Nathan hovered above the battlefield, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. With a powerful beat of his wings, he dove toward another clash just yards away. Only an hour earlier, some 70 or 80 mist shinobi had pressed the leaf forces here. But thanks to Nathan's relentless hit-and-run tactics, fewer than 50 now remained. The Konoha ninjas, too, had paid a steep price, their numbers falling from over 50 to about 40. On the scarred earth below, individual duels raged. Despite their losses, the mist shinobi still held the advantage. They outnumbered the leaf fighters and, on average, displayed greater skill and ferocity. If they hadn't been forced to watch the skies for Nathan's next strike, they might already have routed the Konoha contingent. Every few seconds, a mist ninja would pause mid-attack, glancing upward as though expecting a shadow to blot out the sun. That dread was exactly what Nathan had cultivated. Then, as if summoned by their fear, he reappeared, dropping from the clouds like a thunderbolt. The moment he descended, the mist shinobi faltered. Their once confident assaults lost steam, blades wavered in mid-swing, and chakra-fueled jutsu sputtered. With Nathan back in the fight, the balance would once again shift, and the mist shinobi, despite their numerical edge, found themselves paralyzed by the threat overhead. Nathan hovered high above them, a silent silhouette against the darkening sky. The mist ninjas on the ground shifted restlessly, their eyes flicking upward at every cloud's edge, fully expecting Nathan's trademark sneak attack. But tonight was different. Without warning, he unleashed a flurry of chakra-charged shuriken clones, each spinning blade cutting arcs of shadow across the battlefield, then followed with a roaring torrent of phoenix flame, the fireburst painting the sand with glowing embers. Below, the mist ninjas scattered, diving behind rocks and splashing through puddles to escape the twin onslaught. Their breath came in sharp gasps as they ducked and weaved, desperately tossing kunai and shuriken skyward in futile defiance. Then, just as their guard began to slip at the lack of a second strike, Nathan rocketed downward in a blur. He weaved through the air, effortlessly evading every thrown dagger, and landed, feet firm in the dust, squarely in the middle of the stunned formation. For a heartbeat, the mist ninjas froze. They'd never seen Nathan give up his aerial advantage, never managed to strike him when he hung above the clouds. But now, having watched him drop right into their midst, hope flared in their eyes. Fingers tightened around weapons. Hearts pounding with renewed confidence, they prepared to seize the chance they'd been craving. At once, a mist shinobi bellowed, "Hold him!" The nearby mist ninjas snapped out of their daze. They abandoned their current foes and surged toward Nathan, clearly afraid he might take to the air again. The Konoha shinobi watched in confusion. Why had he dropped so abruptly? From their perspective, Nathan's true value lay in harassing the enemy from above. Coming down now would merely add one more combatant to the ground fight, barely tipping the scales. Yet instinct won out over analysis. Those closest to Nathan moved with lightning speed, weaving through the mist ninjas to keep them occupied and buy time for him to soar away again. Unbeknownst to them, this time Nathan had no intention of leaving. Now that Uchiha Shisui and the others had moved to the opposite front, Nathan no longer needed to worry about them. He could finally focus on the mist ninjas in this sector. For the past 3 days, he'd been careful not only to support the Konoha forces below, but also to conserve his chakra. To minimize risk, he'd avoided engaging any Kirigakure unit larger than a squad, which had left his reserves running low. Scanning the area, Nathan saw dozens of mist shinobi spread out before him. This couldn't possibly be a trap. It was far too perfect an opportunity to pass up. He raised his hand, formed a seal in an instant, and activated his chakra absorption technique. Then he slipped behind a charging Kirigakure Chunin, grabbed the back of the ninja's neck, and began drawing out his chakra. Suddenly, a torrent of stolen energy flooded into Nathan as the Chunin's chakra reserves collapsed like a dam breaking. The mist ninja's eyes went wide with terror as his life force was drained away. Nathan's captive struggled, desperation flickering in his eyes, but it was useless. With a swift motion, Nathan transformed his left hand into a razor-sharp chakra scalpel. He slashed lightly, severing the nerves in the man's limbs until he went limp. Cradling the fallen shinobi, Nathan weaved through the fray, evading incoming strikes as he siphoned off the opponent's chakra, willpower, and stamina. In mere seconds, the first Chunin was drained of every ounce of energy. Without pausing, Nathan hurled the spent body into the path of his attackers, creating a momentary barrier. Then, activating his instant technique, he blinked behind another Kirigakure Chunin. In one fluid motion, he subdued the second shinobi, severed his nerve endings, and used the inert form as a shield while he harvested more chakra. The drained warrior collapsed at Nathan's feet. Again and again, Nathan moved like a phantom through the battlefield. Each time he confronted a new opponent, he rendered them immobile with precise scalpel strikes, then absorbed their chakra and vitality. Before a full minute had passed, 5 Mist Village Chunin lay defeated, their life forces throttled to nothing. Silence fell over the clearing as the remaining Mist Ninjas, once frenzied by overconfidence, exchanged troubled glances. Losing control of the skies had been one thing. Facing Nathan was proving to be far worse. In that tense hush, they realized that this lone shinobi was no ordinary threat. Nathan stood amidst the fallen, calm and unbreached, his eyes scanning for the next challenger. They'd been so reckless just now for 2 reasons. First, their jonin had ordered them to fight with everything they had, no holding back. Second, over the past hour, Nathan's cowardly hit-and-run tactics had driven them to the brink. Every time they pressed forward, he'd fire a single shot and sprint away, leaving them seething with frustration. Now that they finally had a chance to unleash their anger, they'd picked the wrong target to take it out on. Chapter 567, Harvest and Departure. Nathan released the body in his grip and let it slump to the ground. He turned his cold gaze on the 6 Kirigakure Chunin who had finally recovered their wits, and now watched him with wary eyes. They'd been too stunned by his earlier display to strike first, but Nathan wasn't about to give them any quarter. He still needed to drain more chakra before the Kirigakure Jonin slipped beyond reach. Since he'd first made his move nearly a minute ago, he hadn't faced a single Jonin-level opponent, not because of luck, but because Konoha Shinobi had intercepted them. Initially, those allied ninjas had bought him time to regenerate his jutsu and soar into the sky. Yet in only a few dozen seconds, they'd realized Nathan was no ordinary jonin. Even grounded, his power tipped the balance in their favor, so they redoubled their efforts to halt his advance. As the tense silence stretched, Nathan flexed his fingers, chakra coalescing beneath his skin. The Chunin tightened their grips on their weapons, ready to strike if he made a wrong move. But it was Nathan who would strike next, swiftly, devastatingly, until there was nothing left to harvest. Then, with his purpose fulfilled, he would vanish, leaving only whispers of fear in his wake. Nathan wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. In one fluid motion, he shot his hands into the air, formed the tiger hand seal, and unleashed a fire-style jutsu. Scorching burst. An orb of blistering flame erupted in front of him. The nearest Kirigakure Chunin didn't even have time to react. His uniform ignited instantly, and within seconds the fire consumed him. A pained scream echoed through the clearing as he collapsed. "Akato!" someone shouted, but the fallen shinobi was beyond saving. Without pausing to catch his breath, Nathan seized the momentary shock that rippled through the enemy ranks. Twisting his hands into the lotus seal, then crossing his arms to form the Ren hand sign, he channeled his chakra and activated the shadow clone technique. A swirl of smoky energy billowed out, and suddenly there were 5 Nathans where there had been only one. In perfect unison, the quintet charged at the remaining Kirigakure Chunin. Nathan's plan was simple but effective. Overwhelm them with speed and spread his chakra evenly among his clones, ensuring each attack landed with equal force. Nathan's chakra, spent over the past hours of the march here and that morning's skirmish at the Blackstone stronghold, had finally been fully replenished. To build up even more reserves, he split his chakra into shadow clones, and, surprisingly, even these mere clones outclassed the rushing Chunin. In barely 10 seconds, 3 of the Mist Ninja lay bound. 1 was held fast by Nathan himself. 2 more had been overpowered by his clones. Before the remaining pair could even draw a breath, the clones swept in again, and they too were captured. The 6 shinobi who had tried to surround Nathan had been wiped out so swiftly that none of their comrades had time to react. With a single motion, Nathan drained the chakra from the ninja pinned at his feet. In the next instant, he vanished and reappeared before the other combatant, whose body still smoldered with residual flames. Thanks to Nathan's precise control of his fire-release scarlet flame technique, the man had not been incinerated. His burns had already faded. Nathan's crimson Sharingan snapped open, and he locked eyes with the stunned shinobi, ready to plunge him into a powerful genjutsu. Nathan froze in mid-motion. His body, badly burned, throbbed with pain, but he ignored it. With a silent hand seal, he activated the chakra absorption technique, drawing his opponent's chakra straight into himself. Off to the side, a lone mist ninja noticed Nathan's maneuver and decided to intervene. He was isolated. His comrades were either locked in fierce combat with Konoha shinobi or too far away to help, so he dared not advance. Instead, he hurled a kunai from a safe distance. Nathan's sharp gaze caught the kunai's arc, and he spotted the explosive talisman bound to its hilt. Without hesitation, he flicked his wrist and sent a kunai hurtling in return. The 2 blades collided high in the air with a sharp clang. Sparks flew as they ricocheted apart, clattering to the ground. Then, boom! The talisman detonated in a thunderous blast, but Nathan, standing perfectly steady, emerged wholly unscathed. At that moment, Nathan's 4 shadow clones, each having already absorbed the chakra of a nearby mist ninja, slipped away from his side. Without waiting for orders, they rejoined the fray, launching coordinated assaults against the enemy ranks. With Nathan and his shadow clones now reinforcing the Konoha shinobi, the scale of battle tipped decisively in their favor. After the recent chakra absorption, each of Nathan's 4 shadow clones now carried over 30,000 chakra points, far more than the average jonin. In every other respect, too, they matched or exceeded jonin standards. Their defenses were marginally weaker than Nathan's own, but in taijutsu and long-range ninjutsu, they were every bit as lethal. In fact, because Nathan had perfected so many techniques, his clones often struck with even greater force than most frontline shinobi. On top of that, each clone bore a pair of Sharingan. True, the nature of shadow clones prevented them from using their dujutsu at full capacity, but even at 70 or 50% effectiveness, a Sharingan still offered an enormous advantage in perception, genjutsu resistance, and precision. In effect, the Mist Forces were about to face 5 Jonin-level combatants instead of just 1. It was a one-sided contest from the start. While Nathan's real body held its own against a Mist Shinobi flanked by 2 rogue special nin, his 4 clones cut through the main ranks. Within 30 minutes of fierce, unrelenting combat, Nathan and his shadows had slain over 20 of the fewer than 50 Mist Ninja on the field. Another 10 or so fell to Konoha's other allied teams. By the time the smoke cleared, the battlefield lay decisively in Leaf hands, and the Mist's hopes of victory had vanished. By the time they withdrew, only 10 Mist Shinobi remained. In a state of sheer panic, they fled back toward the first battlefield. Under the forest's shadowy canopy, Nathan led a squad of Konoha ninja in pursuit. Abruptly, he came to a halt and peered into the trees behind him. The jonin at his side skidded to a stop as well, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" he asked in a low voice. Nathan raised a hand, motioning for silence, and closed his eyes. He reached out with his senses to detect the tailed beast's chakra that still lingered in the air. At once he felt the aura surge, raw, violent, as if someone had just provoked it. Piecing together Lenovo's earlier speculation, Nathan was all but sure who was responsible. Namikaze Minato, already pitted against the Vulpix. He opened his eyes and met the Jonin's questioning stare. "I've got different orders," he said quietly. "I won't be joining the fight up ahead, for now. Stay alert." Without waiting for a reply, Nathan unleashed his jutsu. Wind release, wings of wind and chakra feather attire erupted around him in a swirl of jade-tinted feathers. In an instant, he soared into the sky, vanishing from view in a blur of speed. Without looking back, Nathan shot off toward the source of that faint aura. On the ground below, a Konoha Jonin opened his mouth as if to call after him, but the chant slipped away. After a heartbeat's hesitation, the Jonin turned to his team and barked, "Don't let him get away! Keep up the chase!" "Yes," came the muted reply. A heavy silence settled over the Konoha shinobi. It was only natural. They had just witnessed Nathan's breathtaking display of power. The departure of such a formidable master inevitably sapped their morale. But no amount of hesitation on their part could alter Nathan's course. There would be no turning back tonight. Chapter 568, Accident Boom. A thunderous explosion ripped through the air just as Nathan arrived on the scene. He'd expected to find only Minato Namikaze and the Vulpix, but instead, the battlefield was swarming with reinforcements. 4 Konoha shinobi flanked Vulpix, while 5 Mist Village Jonin and several Special Jonin pressed in on Minato. Minato was locked in fierce combat with the Mist Ninjas, lightning-fast kunai clashing against shuriken as chakra flared. Behind him, the 4 Konoha warriors held Vulpix in check. From each of their hands shot out a thick, patterned chakra chain. 2 coils wrapped around the fox's neck, the others bound 3 of its tails. Vulpix howled in frustration, muscles straining against the luminous shackles, but the seals held fast. Nathan squinted at the glowing runes traced along the chains. He wasn't a sealing tech specialist, but even he could tell this was a binding-type sealing jutsu, designed not to harm, but to immobilize. Clearly, neither Konoha nor the Mist Village was willing to let Minato or the tailed beast face the enemy alone. One side had dispatched its sealing experts, the other had responded with elite combat jonin to tip the scales. As chakra sparks crackled around him, Nathan took a deep breath. Whatever had led to this tangled web of alliances and betrayals, he knew one thing for certain. The real fireworks were just beginning. But when you really consider it, it makes perfect sense. Forcing Minato Namikaze to confront the Six Tails alone, or allowing that same beast to run wild in the Land of Fire, serves no one's interests. Both hidden villages would suffer, so some covert support had to be arranged. Frankly, when Nara Chiguang first asked him to lend a hand against the beast at the appointed hour, Nathan should have seen this coming. Instead, he was caught up in his own plans and never looked deeper. No wonder he's surprised now. But it doesn't really matter. Whether it's the 5 shinobi from the Hidden Mist or the 4 members of the Konoha sealing team, neither group poses a real threat to the overall strategy or to Nathan's ongoing experiment with his chakra absorption technique. Their presence or absence is negligible. Still, he refused to underestimate them. The moment he appeared on the field, the 5 Mist Ninja turned their heads to size him up. Yet oddly enough, Nathan felt almost no pressure from their stares. Though 4 of his shadow clones still patrolled the perimeter, Nathan's own chakra reserves were far from full. Even after siphoning energy from several defeated Mist Ninjas in their last skirmish, he'd only restored 90,000 points, under 2/3 of his total capacity. Yet statistics meant little once the 5 Mist Hidden Shinobi recognized him. They'd already been tested by the yellow flash. The thought of facing a second prodigy shattered whatever composure remained. Reluctantly, they had to commit forces to take him down. Without exchanging orders, 2 of the 5, a village jonin and a special jonin, broke formation and charged straight at Nathan. By the time they struck, he was already on solid ground. Drawing on the lightning-fast techniques taught by Minato Namikaze, his movements were so swift that a miscalculation could inflict unintended casualties. Anticipating their assault, Nathan took a steadying breath, wove hand seals, and unleashed his signature jutsu, wind style, wind wings. Even so, this foe was beyond what a couple of Mist Nin and a special jonin could handle. They couldn't even pin him down. Before they closed the distance, Nathan's fingers slipped into a hand seal. "Fire release, Phoenix blaze," he barked, and a roaring jet of flame shot toward the special Jonin. The technique was over in the blink of an eye. Seal formed, fire unleashed. The Jonin twisted away at the last moment, but Nathan spotted a singed cuff on his cloak, proof that his reflexes, while good, weren't exceptional. Seizing on that weakness, Nathan whipped out a kunai. A second Mistnin's blade flew at him, but the two weapons met in midair with a sharp clang. He barely had time to register the clash when a low voice cried out in front of him. "Water release, water dragon bullet." A coiling dragon of water surged toward Nathan, hissing as it cut through the air. Determined not to be caught off guard again, he braced for the next move. A torrent of chakra coalesced into a massive water dragon, barreling down toward Nathan like a tidal wave. Calm and composed, Nathan took a step back, drew in a steady breath, and formed the necessary hand seals. With a sharp exhale, he unleashed his earth release, earth-flowing wall. The ground trembled as a solid barrier of earth, some 20 meters long and nearly 8 meters high, surged upward, intercepting the water dragon's full force. The impact shook the nearby terrain, but the barrier held firm, cracking neither in facade nor in spirit. Nathan stood safely behind it, untouched by the onslaught. In the hierarchy of the 5 chakra natures, earth is the greatest counter to water, and Nathan's earth-flowing wall was far more than a casual defense. Recognizing his opponent's water release, water dragon bullet technique left him no room for hesitation. Instead, he proved precisely why mastery of the elements can turn the tide of any battle. The 5 chakra natures are said to counter one another, but that only holds true when the combatants are on equal footing and their techniques are similarly matched. If Senju Tobarama's water release, water-breaking wave had taken the place of the attack Nathan faced, he wouldn't have dared raise an earth release, earth-flowing wall in its path. The water technique would have shattered his earth barrier without a second thought. The exchange was over in the blink of an eye. Nathan barely had time to catch his breath before a volley of shurikens streaked in from his side, each blade aimed at his vital points. He whirled to see a Kirigakure special Jonin who'd slipped around behind him, seizing the moment for a surprise strike. Even so, the assault posed no real threat. Nathan's gaze locked onto the spinning stars. In an instant, he calculated their trajectories and, with a barely perceptible shift of his weight, slipped cleanly out of their path. Without hesitation, he drew a shuriken, formed the required seals, and unleashed the shuriken shadow clone technique. In midair, the single blade fractured into hundreds of perfect duplicates, each one arching toward the hidden Jonin in a deadly rain of steel. Nathan released a flurry of shurikens at the Kirigakure special Jonin, methodically sealing off every escape route. Though the assault looked chaotic, each blade was precisely aimed. The Jonin's eyes widened as metal whistled toward him. He snatched up a kunai and fell back, bracing his forearms to block the onslaught. Clang, clang, the air rang with the clash of steel. The Jonin's arms blurred as he deflected wave after wave of shuriken, parrying nearly every strike. Yet Nathan's control was flawless. A few shurikens slipped past the defenses like slippery fish, covertly weaving through the gaps. They scored across the Jonin's torso, leaving both deep and superficial gashes. Blood seeped through his uniform, bright and spreading. Amada Hideo gritted his teeth against the pain, but barely flinched. He steadied his breathing and leveled a wary gaze at Nathan, eyes sharp with suspicion. Nathan allowed himself a cold sneer. He drew the long sword from his waist, ready to press his advantage and finish the fight. Before he could move, another Kirigakure Jonin darted in and intercepted him. The newcomer's presence halted Nathan's next strike in midair, forcing him to pause with blade raised. The two shinobi faced off, tension crackling between them as Hideo steadied himself in the background, eyes flicking warily from one adversary to the next. It was none other than the Jonin who had just unleashed the water style, water dragon bullet technique. Chapter 569, Retreat. He's incredibly fast. Nathan tore his gaze from Hideo Amada and zeroed in on the Jonin standing before him. A green aura flared around his body as he activated the instant sword technique, surging forward in a blur. Clang! His long sword sliced through the air, only to be met by the steady clang of a kunai. Kagami Kazuhiro, his opponent, had raised the blade just in time to block the blow. Refusing to give his foe a moment's respite, Nathan channeled chakra and mental energy into his Sharingan, preparing to ensnare Kagami with a potent genjutsu. But the Jonin, seasoned in countering Uchiha illusions, closed his eyes the instant he sensed the trap and slipped free of its pull. In one smooth motion, he sprang backward, putting distance between them. As he retreated, Kagami flung several shuriken at Nathan, each spinning with lethal intent. Such projectiles could slow down most shinobi, but Nathan was no ordinary ninja. With a deft sidestep and a flick of his wrist, he let the blades whistle harmlessly past. Unfazed, Nathan straightened, eyes locked on Kagami's retreating form. The real battle was only just beginning. Nathan stomped the ground with both feet. The earth cracked beneath him, and he launched forward like a human cannonball, closing the gap between him and his opponent in an instant. Under normal circumstances, he could have chained his attacks seamlessly, but that split second bought by Kazuhiro's flying shuriken gave the ninja time to prepare his next move. With a quick reach into his utility bag, Kazuhiro Kagome withdrew a handful of cold-glowing caltrops. In one fluid motion, he flung them across Nathan's only path. Nathan's eyes narrowed. He'd rarely encountered such insidious traps in past battles. One wrong step, and a spike would pierce his shoe's sole, wounding his foot, and if Kazuhiro had coated them in poison, the consequences could be far worse. Admittedly, Kazuhiro had handled the caltrops with his bare hands, not tweezers, so toxins seemed unlikely. Nathan's superhuman healing would patch him up quickly. Still, the agony the instant a spike broke his skin was unavoidable. Nathan wasn't afraid of pain, but that didn't make him a masochist. If this had been a life-or-death moment, he'd have simply endured the agony until it passed. This, however, was not that moment. The opponent facing him, even with a special jonin standing nearby, posed hardly any real threat. Strictly speaking, he'd only been sent to assist Namikaze Minato. It was Minato who was anxious, not him. There was no point in torturing himself. He shrugged off his doubts, slowed his pace, and let his Sharingan survey the battlefield. In just a few steps, he'd located the perfect spot to lie in wait. But Kazuhiro Shangfang had clearly regained his footing, and Hideo Amada, who'd been hovering at a distance, moved in to join the fray. Suddenly, Nathan was facing two determined opponents who no longer feared his illusions. Of course, that assumed Nathan wanted to trade blows. After a moment's thought, he realized he had no such plan. It was safe to say this fight would be disappointingly dull. On the contrary, Minato's side of the battle suddenly intensified. When he'd been facing 5 opponents, caution and reconnaissance had been essential. But with only 3 opponents now, he could afford to throw all restraint to the wind. This reckless strategy was both Nathan's suggestion and Minato's own instinct. The moment he struck at Kazuhiro Kamigami and Hideo Amada, the Kirigakure Jonin dropped their guard and counterattacked with everything they had. In an instant, all 3 were driven onto the defensive, unable to respond effectively. It proved that Minato was no coward. He knew when to hold back and when to press the attack without hesitation. Of course, part of his advantage came from the Vulpix, which was beginning to lose control. Though it had shown only 3 tails so far and had not yet released its full power, even 4 lower-ranked Konoha shinobi armed with a heavy sealing jutsu wouldn't be able to contain it for long. After all, to harness the power of weighing 1,000 pounds with only 4 ounces, you actually have to possess those 4 ounces, and the 4 Konoha shinobi before him clearly didn't. Disregarding them, Nathan gave his long blade a sharp double ting and effortlessly parried the combined assaults of Kazuhiro and Hideo Amada. Each deflection felt silky smooth, a rush of pure satisfaction. Unsurprisingly, his momentary ease didn't escape his opponent's notice, but neither Kazuhiro nor Hideo could find an opening. "Damn him!" Hideo muttered, hastening his strikes and forcing a slight misstep in their coordination. Nathan caught the shift instantly. He leaned into Hideo's frustration, baiting him with feints and creating deliberate openings. Then, in a single heartbeat, an Amada kunai lunged for Nathan's side. His eyes snapped open, blazing with the Sharingan's power. In that instant, Nathan locked onto the blade's trajectory and, at the same time, sensed everything lurking just beyond his strike. Nathan's body whipped around in a single, fluid motion, and he narrowly escaped the twin strikes, the slashing swing of Kazuohiro from behind and Hideo Amada's forward thrust. Both assailants froze for the briefest moment, eyes widening as they realized their attacks had overlapped and left them exposed. Nathan didn't hesitate. In the same instant he dodged, he brought his long blade slicing toward Hideo's neck. A bright clang rang out as Nathan's knife met Hideo's kunai in a violent clash of steel. The impact drove Hideo back a half step, his arms trembling under the sudden force. But before Nathan could follow up, Shangfang Hehong, closing in from behind, twisted his wrist. The kunai that Hideo had blocked with now swept in a horizontal arc, aiming straight for Nathan's midsection. Nathan didn't flinch under the onslaught. Instead of dodging, he simply turned his head to meet his attacker's gaze. In Shangfang Hehong's sight, Nathan's scarlet Sharingan glowed like blood-stained glass, radiating a bone-chilling aura. Genjutsu? Shangfang Hehong's heart skipped. Nathan was about to unleash a powerful illusion. Since Uchiha Hideo was still staggered from Nathan's last strike and had no opportunity to intervene, Shangfang Hehong dared not resist. He feared being torn apart by whatever combo Nathan had in store. He squeezed his eyes shut and leapt backward. The hurried retreat, however, garbled his hand seals, and his blade nicked only the surface of Nathan's waist. The shallow cut was actually milder than the self-inflicted wound Nathan had once used to test his own healing. Left alone, it would seal up in no more than 3 minutes. Nathan wasted no time. Channeling chakra into the injury, he supercharged his body's repair process. Within a single minute, the cut vanished altogether. Nathan gave a satisfied nod, then refocused on the Kirigakure special jonin standing before him. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and swung his blade again, this time aiming squarely at the jonin's throat. Sensing the danger, Amada Hideo raised his arm to block, but at that moment, Nathan's Sharingan flared to life. Weaving its power into the steel, he unleashed his illusory sword technique. Suddenly, Amada Hideo's vision fractured. The single blade in his sight split into 3, each edge shimmering menacingly. His pupils contracted as he realized he'd been caught in a genjutsu. A veteran special jonin, he immediately focused his will and disrupted the chakra sustaining the illusion. In an instant, the 3 blades snapped back into 1. "Pathetic trick," he growled, pride flaring in his chest. With a sharp movement, he thrust the kunai in his hand forward to block Nathan's attack. Although shaking off the illusion had slowed his reaction, he now readied himself to counterstrike. As long as he could weather Nathan's assault, everything would settle back to the way it was once Shangfang and Hong rejoined the fray. That's what Uchiha Hideo kept telling himself, but reality had other plans. Nathan's blade looked powerful, yet when it struck, it carried almost no force, nowhere near the impact of his earlier attacks. All of Uchiha's hidden power release had been for nothing. What puzzled him even more was Nathan's hesitation. He'd had the perfect moment to counterattack fiercely, to seize control of the fight. Yet he held back. Blowing such a golden opportunity went against everything Uchiha knew about seasoned fighters. Something was clearly amiss. Uchiha refused to believe Nathan simply hadn't reacted in time. Despite his youth, Nathan was hardly inexperienced in combat. Missing an opening that blatant wasn't the mark of a beginner. It was a deliberate choice. And now Uchiha's mind raced to understand why. Even if Hideo Amada had slipped up, his 3 Magatama Sharingan, renowned for its piercing insight, should have detected and corrected the mistake. Yet in practice, he never seized that critical opening. What just happened? Panic roiled in Hideo's mind as a cold dread gripped his heart. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of Nathan's lips curling into a strange, knowing smile. The next instant, white-hot agony exploded in his abdomen. Glancing down, Hideo saw Nathan's left hand wrapped around a swirling light blue chakra sphere and pressed firmly against his lower stomach. A torrent of blood burst from his mouth. The fleeting pride Hideo had felt when he thought he'd dispelled Nathan's illusion sword technique turned to ash. Through clenched teeth, he managed, "You did that on purpose?" Nathan said nothing. He simply tightened his grip, channeling more chakra into the sphere. Then, with a thunderous roar, the level 8 Rasengan detonated. The blast threw Hideo across the clearing like a rag doll, sending him crashing against a distant tree. As he slumped to the ground, vision blurring, Hideo realized his final, painful truth. Nathan's insight had been correct all along. Nathan had deliberately let his opponent dispel the trailing illusion of his sword technique, just so he could slip in a silent Rasengan strike. It was a textbook diversion. Draw attention to the obvious, then spring your true move in secret. He'd learned in their first duel that his enemy's awareness was only so-so. Otherwise, he'd never have dared to bluff so brazenly. With a resounding crash, Hideo Amada collapsed. Nathan's gaze snapped upward to Kazuhiro, who had just opened his eyes and planted his feet firmly on the ground. What looked like a prolonged fight had, in reality, ended in the blink of an eye, so fast that Kazuhiro, along with their comrades Shangfeng and Hong, only caught the instant their ally fell. The finer points of the clash were lost to them. Now Kazuhiro studied Nathan coolly, then glanced back at Hideo, still struggling to stand, and began plotting how best to buy himself time. "Retreat!" The shout rang out, cutting through the tension. Nathan and Shang He-Hong spun around at the same time. Two Kirigakure Jonin were charging toward them, one clutching his injured arm, the other pressing a hand to his bleeding side. Behind these wounded shinobi stood Minato Namikaze, calmly withdrawing a kunai from the chest of a fallen comrade. Crimson dripped from the blade, a silent testament to the battle's outcome. It was clear, Minato had won. Now only one question remained in Nathan's mind. Should he intervene to stop the injured Jonin, or trust that Minato would handle whatever came next? Chapter 570, Vulpix. Nathan hesitated, ready to leap in, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Namikaze Minato's steady gaze silently ordering him to stand down. He paused, puzzled, but before he could react, a mist shinobi darted behind him, pressing a hand against Nathan's lower back, and whirling his fingers into a rapid sequence of hand seals. "What?" Nathan thought, his senses suddenly on high alert. Then the air tore open with a beastly roar, so fierce it rattled his bones. The sound was drenched in malice, tinged with the exultation of a creature tasting freedom. Nathan's heart lurched. "It can't be! 6 tails!" He whirled toward the source of the roar. Where a 3-tailed form had squirmed under the shinobi's sealing jutsu only moments before, new tails were bursting into being, 4, then 5, then a 6th. The dense sealing array that had encased the beast flickered and collapsed, and the beast's aura swelled, radiant and terrifying. Across the clearing, the 4 Konoha sealers' faces drained of color. One of them lunged forward, palm thrust open, and unleashed a snarl of chakra chains. They shot through the air like silver serpents, coiling tightly around the newest tail. The beast's triumphant bellow hit a wall of shinobi will, its flood of energy pausing as the chains bit into its flesh. Nathan steadied his breath, eyes locked on the restrained beast. Somewhere inside that locked roar lay the power they all knew would change the course of this battle. So long as that 6th tail remained bound, they still had a chance. The beast's roar grew even more furious. As its bellow shook the clearing, the 4 existing tails quivered, and in an instant, 2 more burst forth. All 6 tails now fanned out behind it, and the creature's bulk swelled, doubling in size a few times over with barely a breath. The 4 Konoha shinobi standing below looked no larger than insects. Even though 5 chakra chains still coiled around the beast, they were as powerless as an ant trying to restrain an elephant. With another thunderous roar, the 6-tailed monster lashed out. 2 of its free tails whipped toward the 2 sealing specialists. "Ah! Ah!" 2 sharp cries rang out as those shinobi were swept aside, slammed into the earth until they turned into little more than mud. The 6-tailed beast may not be famed for brute strength, but its sheer mass made that casual sweep more than enough to crush any human defenses. The fallen ninja's chakra chains snapped apart, and 2 more of the beast's tails sprang free. Roaring in triumph, the creature swung its remaining 4 tails in perfect unison, striking at the last 2 members of the sealing team. Its attack was so swift and devastating that the pair didn't even have time to react. Nathan pressed himself against the shattered earth, watching in horror as the 6 tails loomed over his friends. 2 of their comrades had already fallen, and now the remaining pair bore despair on their faces, bracing for the same fate. Then, in the blink of an eye, a flash of light cut through the gloom. A figure with golden hair and a calm, determined face appeared beside the doomed duo. It was Minato Namikaze. Before the beast's attack could land, Minato swept his arms around both shinobi, drawing them into his embrace. At that instant, he activated his signature Flying Thunder God technique and vanished from sight. Boom! The six tails' four massive tails smashed into the spot they just occupied. The ground trembled, sending soil and gravel skyward in a blinding shower. Unleashed from its restraints, the beast's power surged in a roar that shook the battlefield. All of it had happened in a heartbeat. As Nathan steadied his racing pulse, he finally understood the Mist Ninja's earlier seal. Rather than binding them, it had lifted the seal on the Vulpix. Now fully freed, the Firefox's energy would cover their retreat. With new hope kindling in his chest, Nathan knew it was time to run. Just as Minato Namikaze hauled the two Sealing class members to safety, the other three shinobi, Shange, Ho, Eng, and their companion, simultaneously lobbed smoke bombs to the ground. With muffled thuds and bursts of flame, a thick cloud billowed up, shrouding their retreating forms in gray haze. Nathan watched it happen without surprise. He could have dispelled the smoke in an instant. Byakugan vision alone would pierce the fog, and a simple, wind-release, body replacement would scatter it altogether. But he didn't move against them. Not out of mercy, but because he had a higher priority. 3 Jonin, even injured, wouldn't fall in mere moments, and Nathan had no time for a drawn-out skirmish. Across the clearing, Minato was already engaged in a fierce duel with the Vulpix. Nathan took a single step forward, intending to join the fight, then abruptly stopped, his brow furrowing. With barely a sound, he unleashed the body flicker technique, vanishing in a flash of air and instantly reappearing beside the gravelly wounded Hideo Ameda. Nathan's eyes locked onto the ground beneath him as he let out a cold snort. Humph! Letting you go was mercy enough, and now you think you can steal my prize? You clearly don't value your life. With that, he drove his heel down hard. A surge of earth-release chakra pulsed through the soil, as if petrifying the very earth. From somewhere below came a muffled groan. Then, almost immediately, the sound of breath fleeing underground stuttered and vanished. Nathan didn't need to see who it was, one of the 3 who'd escaped with smoke bombs, no doubt returning to rescue Hideo Ameda. He'd cut off that hope before it even reached the surface. Satisfied the intruder was gone, Nathan raised his hand and formed a seal in one fluid motion, summoning the chakra absorption technique. Hideo's eyes flickered with alarm. He tried to struggle, but the Rasengan wound Nathan had dealt him moments earlier left him too weak to resist. As the absorption chakra flowed in, Hideo realized with horror that he had no chance. Nathan seized his fallen foe and, in only a few breaths, siphoned away every last flicker of chakra, mental, physical, and spiritual. Still, the man had been gravely wounded beforehand, so Nathan only gained a little over 10,000 chakra points. Unimpressed, he shrugged off the limp body and immediately activated Wind Escape, wind wings soaring high into the sky. Below him, the enormous Vulpix was in the throes of a furious assault. Its 6 fox-like tails whipped through the air, each swipe aimed at Namikaze Minato, but Minato darted and weaved out of reach with uncanny speed. Frustrated, the beast let out a thunderous roar, its tails lashing even more violently. Without hesitation, Nathan plunged toward the fray. Before Vulpix could brace itself, he formed a precise hand seal and unleashed his ninjutsu, Fire Release, Susaki Jutsu. Facing a creature of that scale meant sparing no chakra, so Nathan poured nearly 500 points into the jutsu at once. In an instant, a sphere of crimson fire blossomed on Vulpix's chest, racing upward and engulfing a full third of its body in roaring flames. Even a nimble, fox-like monster with 6 tails stood little chance against such a searing inferno. Minato Namikaze froze the moment he heard that agonized roar. He had just been about to charge in and strike the submerged beast, until a surge of raw chakra exploded from its body. An oppressive force rippled outward, pressing down on everyone around. Minato, standing closest, was driven back several yards, off his feet. Up above, Nathan, hovering in midair, was battered dozens of meters away before he could steady himself. Even the 2 Sealing-class shinobi lurking in the treetops a few hundred meters off shivered involuntarily, their necks tightening with dread. Such a ferocious chakra presence was beyond anything ordinary ninjas could challenge. Its brutality would snuff out the courage of all but the toughest. But neither Minato nor Nathan wavered. Though Minato landed hard, the resolute gleam in his eyes only sharpened. And Nathan's reaction was even more spectacular. His breathing slowed, his chakra flared in brilliant pulses, and his stance, still airborne, became rock-steady. Confronted with such overwhelming power, both men braced themselves, resolve burning brighter than ever. Nathan showed no hint of fear. Instead, he stared at the Vulpix as though it were a priceless treasure, a greedy gleam flickering in his eyes. Chapter 571, Joining Forces. Nathan's momentary lapse into greed was brief. He reminded himself why he'd come here in the first place. Resolute, he poured a surge of chakra into Vulpix, coating the little fox in a slick film that instantly snuffed out the flames roaring across its fur. With a thunderous roar, Vulpix shook its head and fixed Nathan with furious amber eyes. Even from where he stood, the anger was palpable. But did the beast really believe he stood alone? Before Vulpix could strike again, another presence made itself known. Namikaze Minato's keen battle sense was already active the instant the fox reared back. No elaborate seals, no fanfare. Just a handful of kunai stamped with explosive tags. Explosive tags were deadly even to a tailed beast. If all of them detonated against its vital areas, the blast could cripple, or worse, finish it. Seeing the metal projectile streak in, Vulpix snapped its gaze toward Minato. In one swift motion, it arched its body and swung its tail like a massive whip, desperately trying to knock the kunai aside before they could strike home. But Minato's timing was impeccable. The kunai cut through the air in perfect unison, each headed straight for a critical point. Now, Nathan and Minato had Vulpix exactly where they wanted it, and the real battle was about to begin. When Vulpix's tail crashed into the kunai, Minato Namikaze didn't hesitate. He formed a hand seal in an instant and barked, "Explosion!" Fireballs detonated along the length of the fox's tail, the air ripping with each blast as flames engulfed the creature. Vulpix howled in agony, and then, in retaliation, unleashed a torrential spray of corrosive liquid. The acidic downpour sizzled across the clearing, capable of obliterating any ninja in its path with a single strike. But against the world's fastest shinobi, even this devastating gambit stood no chance. In the same heartbeat the acid flew, Minato activated his Flying Thunder God technique. He vanished from sight and reappeared on the far edge of the jungle, exactly along the escape route he'd prepared. Below, the corrosive flood ate into the earth and undergrowth. Hissing steam rose in a 100-meter radius, suffusing the air with a harsh, acrid stench. Even where no acid had landed, trees and vines bore the unmistakable marks of chemical burn. Nathan watched the swirling white mist writhe across the battlefield, its corrosive edge hissing as it ate away at the earth. He knew it was his turn to act. Minato couldn't get anywhere near the enemy while that vapor lingered. Wings unfurling, Nathan darted forward like a bolt of lightning. As he neared the mist, he shaped his fingers into a seal and unleashed his jutsu. Wind release. Great breakthrough. A howling gust roared from his mouth, shredding the noxious clouds and sending Vulpix reeling. For a creature of its size, staggering under the force of a single blast spoke volumes about Nathan's skill. Minato's eyes gleamed. Seizing the opening, he slipped past the dissipating fog and closed in on Vulpix. This time, he relied on raw talent rather than trickery or explosive tags. His hands moved into a familiar formation, and he called upon a straightforward but precise C-rank technique, fire release, fireball jutsu. Though the jutsu itself was unremarkable, Minato aimed it unerringly at Vulpix's head. With a thunderous roar, the crimson sphere struck home, erupting against the Pokemon's face. Vulpix let out a pained howl as flame and smoke billowed around it, proof that Minato's timing and aim were just as deadly as any high-level ninjutsu. Vulpix didn't hesitate. It lashed out with all 6 of its fiery tails, aiming to overwhelm Namikaze Minato in a single, furious sweep. But Minato's reflexes were far too fast. His inhuman reaction speed let him dodge every strike with ease. Were it not for the shockwaves each tail created when it slammed into the earth, shattering stone and sending debris flying, Minato could have toyed with the fox for hours. Even so, he managed to keep Vulpix contained. As Vulpix's attention stayed fixed on Minato, Nathan jumped back, activating his wind escape to reposition himself. In an instant, he reappeared behind the fox. Planting his feet firmly on the ground, Nathan wove his hands into a tight seal and unleashed his signature ninjutsu, Fire Release, Dragon Fire Jutsu. A gout of flame roared from Nathan's mouth, splitting into 3 coiling fire dragons that slammed toward Vulpix from left, center, and right. The fox sensed danger too late. Its bulky frame and Nathan's stealthy approach left it no room to dodge. The 3 dragons converged in a scorching embrace, striking Vulpix full on. Boom, boom. 3 sinuous fire dragons streaked across the battlefield, converging on Vulpix in a blazing inferno. The 9-tailed beast bellowed in defiance, its massive chakra cloak rippling, but barely dimmed under the onslaught. A tailed beast's aura is a fortress unto itself. Nathan stole a glance at the water ceiling barrier spiraling behind him. It lay motionless, no ceiling jutsu, no counterattack, giving him the opening he needed. This wasn't mindless bravado. He intended to test the true lethality of his ninjutsu on a tailed beast, vital data for future captures once the war was over. He backed up 15 feet and wove a swift series of hand seals. Before Vulpix could recover, Nathan threw out his palm and shouted, "Water release, water-breaking wave." A narrow, high-pressure jet of water erupted from his hand, slicing cleanly through half of Vulpix's massive body. The beast's thunderous roar erupted into a pained scream. This blow had torn deeper than any before, and a violent surge of chakra spilled from the wound, illuminating the field with its raw, unbridled power. Minato Namikaze ignored Nathan's provocation. He turned back and opened his mouth, unleashing a dense, steam-like acid mist straight at Nathan in midair. The corrosive cloud spread almost instantaneously, closing in on Nathan before he could even react. Nathan could have dodged by accelerating away, but instead he stood his ground. Seizing the moment when Minato's mouth was still agape, he trusted his instincts. In a fluid motion, he raised his right hand, formed a tight seal, and invoked his ninjutsu, Chakra Feather Garment. A soft glow of pale blue erupted around him as a robe of ethereal feathers wrapped his body. The acid rain hissed against the barrier, but the garment held, barely. Nathan felt the corrosive mist gnawing at the chakra threads that bound his jutsu. If he remained encased in this robe, its structure would collapse in less than 30 seconds, leaving him vulnerable to the acid's full force. 30 seconds. He had a very narrow window to turn the tide of this confrontation. Enough! Nathan gritted his teeth and lashed out with his wings, propelling himself straight toward the gaping maw of the 6 tails. But the acidic mist had already begun to eat away at his chakra wings. Even though his wind style, wind wings, was perfected and his condensed chakra wings felt rock steady, the corrosive haze had cut his speed to less than 30% of peak performance. That half-broken pace gave the great beast precious seconds to react. Tailed beasts seldom hold earnest conversations with humans. Despite wielding intelligence that rivals our own, they rarely exercise it on human affairs. Still, Nathan's reckless advance set the 6 tails on edge. Instinctively, it snapped its ferocious jaws closed. Then 2 glowing crimson Sharingan appeared in its line of sight. The beast's will faltered, and its massive mouth paused mid-snap. Yet Nathan, too, froze. He felt a sharp pain around his eyes as 2 rivulets of blood ran down his cheeks. His face twitched, muscles taut with effort. Finally, he drew a shuddering breath and whispered to himself, "Is this the will of the tailed beast? This is outright tyranny." Nathan's head throbbed as he recognized the truth. While his illusion bound the 6 tails, he himself was being dragged under by its hateful will. Of course, Gaara had spiraled into madness so early. Anyone forced to carry such a tyrannical hatred couldn't help but fracture. Steeling himself against the pounding pain, Nathan shot forward and hovered before the beast's gaping maw. He raised his right hand, and instantly the air around him began to rip and hiss. A colossal disk of pure chakra, a spinning shuriken, tore through the wind with a sizzling roar. It was the S-rank forbidden technique, wind-style spiral shuriken. Months had passed since Nathan last unleashed this move in battle, and now it would test its power against a tailed beast. With unflinching resolve, he poured every ounce of chakra into his palm and launched the Rasen Shuriken straight into the 6 tails' open jaws. Even though the 6-tailed beast straddled the boundary between flesh and blood life and pure chakra, the wind release, Rasen Shuriken, still shredded its physiology on a microscopic level. Millions of razor-fine chakra needles tore through its cells. The creature let out a deafening roar of pain, broke free from the illusion's grip, and thrashed its massive tails in a frenzied escape. A dull thud rang out as one of those tails caught Nathan squarely. He was sent hurtling backward like a human cannonball. Yet thanks to his earth release, armoring technique, and the protective chakra feather cloak, he walked away without serious injury. In fact, the raw force of the impact flung him clear of the beast's corrosive mist and beyond the range of its unbridled fury. Nathan spat a stream of blood onto the ground, then lifted his gaze. Not far off, the Vulpix stood ready, its eyes blazing with anticipation, evidence that his opening attack had succeeded. Nathan allowed himself a tight, satisfied smile. Now it was Minato Namikaze's turn to take the field. Taking a steadying breath, Nathan fixed his eyes on the uneven earth beneath him, preparing for whatever came next. Chapter 507-2 Thoughts, Suppression, and Absorption. Minato Namikaze finally shook off his stunned daze. Before he'd left the village, Hokage Sarutobi Hiruzen had warned him about Nathan, a shinobi rumored to wield a ninjutsu of extraordinary destructive power. At the time, Minato had assumed Hiruzen's report was at least a bit exaggerated. Now, witnessing Nathan unleash Wind Release, Rasen Shuriken, and seeing how brutally the Six Tails beast was torn apart, Minato understood that Hiruzen had not overstated the truth. He had undersold it. Nathan's talent was beyond exceptional. Minato's sharp eyes traced the technique's lineage. Wind Release, Rasen Shuriken clearly built upon the foundation of the Rasengan. He recalled the single time he'd seen Nathan form a Rasengan, back when he'd first heard about the young shinobi's promise. Even then, Minato had recognized Nathan's skill. He'd assumed the boy must have learned, or at least been inspired by watching Minato himself, or perhaps Master Jiraiya perform the technique. But seeing Nathan's mastery now, Minato realized the youth's talent lay not in imitation, but in innovation, and in the raw power he wielded so effortlessly. Despite its flair for the dramatic, Nathan's latest technique still fell within the bounds of possibility. After all, inspiration is the lifeblood of any new ninjutsu. Yet what he'd done with the Rasengan went far beyond mere imitation. Neither Jiraiya nor I had ever carried that step to fruition, and Nathan's success spoke volumes. On top of that, he'd unveiled Wind Style, Wind Wings, a soaring jutsu already making waves on the battlefield. It was clearly his own invention. And as if that weren't enough, I just witnessed another original technique, a full-body protective barrier that evoked the power of the tailed beast cloak. These breakthroughs weren't just the mark of genius, they bordered on the uncanny. As I weighed the implications, my thoughts drifted to the fragile ties between the village and the Uchiha clan. The more I considered it, the more a headache throbbed at my temples. Minato Namikaze had no idea that Danzo and his clandestine root operatives had been plotting against Nathan all along. As Hiruzen Sarutobi's chosen successor, and an Uchiha prodigy in his own right, Nathan enjoyed access to intelligence far beyond that of an ordinary jonin. When Nara Chiguang submitted his latest report to the village council, he'd quietly flagged a troubling pattern. Someone was deliberately targeting Nathan. That revelation only underscored the simmering mistrust between Konoha's leadership and the Uchiha clan. Clearly, certain factions within the village feared having not one but two Uchiha geniuses rising through the ranks. Minato couldn't help but think of Itachi Uchiha, whose reputation matched Nathan's. But driving a wedge between these young shinobi served no one, only deepened the rift, threatening Konoha's stability. Minato believed the wiser course would be to embrace talents like Nathan and Itachi, using their success to heal old wounds between Senju and Uchiha families over the next decade or two. Yet with a soft sigh, he reminded himself that such policy decisions weren't his to make. He was still an Anbu captain, not the Hokage. Shaking off his reverie, Minato refocused on the Vulpix curled obediently at his feet. Minato had originally planned to team up with Nathan, using Nathan's energy-draining strike to weaken the Vulpix, then pouring every ounce of his chakra into a sealing jutsu. But Nathan's last blow had already hit the fox's true weakness. The Vulpix writhed on the scorched ground, its fiery fur oozing dark mucus, its flesh softening and visibly shrinking as if melting under unbearable pain. All Minato needed now was to seal it. Without a moment's hesitation, he launched 2 shurikens straight into the Vulpix's flanks. As the blades sank home, he formed the requisite hand seals and invoked the shadow clone technique. A cloud of golden chakra smoke billowed out, and where one Minato had stood, 4 now stood in perfect formation. Or he could give a command. The 3 clones vanished in streaks of yellow light, the telltale sign of the Flying Thunder God technique, and reappeared at the Vulpix's left, right, and front, hemming the fox in on all sides. The stage was set. The sealing jutsu would follow immediately. At this point, Minato Namikaze had already slipped a Flying Thunder God-imbued kunai right in front of the Vulpix. Between that planted blade, the 2 he'd just thrown, and his own sudden appearances, his true body and 3 shadow clones took up positions on all sides, hemming the fox in completely. The Vulpix sensed the trap and focused its attention on Minato, lashing out with a sweeping tail strike aimed to crush him. But its reaction was too slow. Before the tail could land, Minato and his clones finished their sealing hand seals. A faint clink rang through the air as 8 chakra chains, each inscribed with sealing talismans, shot from their outstretched hands. 6 of those chains darted straight for the Vulpix's 6 tails, coiling tightly around each one to stifle its chakra and prevent further attacks. While the fox struggled to free itself, Minato sent the remaining 2 chains racing around its neck and waist. Now bound by all 8 sealing chains, the Vulpix was pinned so thoroughly it could hardly move. Nathan's eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, instantly recognizing the sealing technique at work. It was the same method he and the other 4 students from his sealing class had just practiced, and yet it had a distinctive twist that marked it as something more advanced. The hand signs, the flow of chakra, the unbreakable binding lines. It was clearly derived from the Uzumaki clan's legendary Diamond Seal. With Kushina Uzumaki as Minato Namikaze's wife, and given Minato's natural aptitude for fuinjutsu, Nathan realized this must be Minato's own enhanced version of the technique. Just like the original Diamond Seal, Minato's variant could directly immobilize a tailed beast, rendering it utterly helpless. Nathan felt a pang of regret that such a powerful jutsu was rooted in complex theoretical knowledge, something you couldn't simply copy by watching, Sharingan or no Sharingan. Mastering it would require years of study. If he could ever learn Minato's improvements, dealing with a tailed beast in the field would be far less daunting. Before Nathan could dwell on that possibility, the 6 tails on the battlefield emitted a furious roar and thrashed wildly, desperate to escape. It had only just broken free from its prison cage, and now, with the spectral seals already materializing around its massive form, it sensed that it was about to be trapped all over again. Roar! The monster's defiance echoed through the clearing as Minato's refined diamond seal tightened its grip. Violent chakra roiled around the seal, each of the 8 chains groaning under the strain as they glowed with unstable energy, threatening to snap at any moment. From below, Minato Namikaze's voice rang out. "Jonin Nathan!" He sounded desperate, but Nathan had already leapt to the very top of the Vulpix's head. The beast snarled, eyes blazing with fury, yet Nathan wasted no time. He wove the final hand seals in a blur and pressed his palm firmly against Vulpix's skull. "Everything hinges on this," he muttered under his breath. In an instant, Nathan activated his chakra absorption technique. Like a powerful vacuum, it yanked the Vulpix's heavy, turbulent chakra through the fading seal and forced it into Nathan's body. At the same moment, a wave of crushing mental pressure slammed into him. Stars exploded across Nathan's vision. His head spun, and nausea threatened to overtake him. But he'd endured this before, back when he first tried to control Vulpix with his Sharingan. Drawing on that memory, he gritted his teeth, fought through the dizziness, and forced his senses back into focus. Minato's surprised gaze met his. With a steadying breath, Nathan channeled his willpower into the task at hand, carefully absorbing and refining the tailed beast's chakra deep within himself. Nathan exhaled in relief. The worst-case scenario hadn't come to pass. Even at only level 6, his chakra absorption technique could draw out a tailed beast's chakra, but it still posed serious challenges. When he first tried to digest that overwhelming chakra, he'd felt the tailed beast's will battering his mind. It was nothing like absorbing ordinary human chakra. A human's spiritual imprint is scrubbed clean by the very ninjutsu that transforms their chakra, so a skilled shinobi feels no psychic backlash. But tailed beasts are different. Their wills are ancient and fierce, and without proper safeguards, anyone, even a top-tier shinobi, could be driven mad by the assault. That had been the hidden danger in his technique's earlier iterations. But Nathan had spent weeks refining his method, forging higher sublimations into the core of his ninjutsu so that it would filter out a beast's rogue spirit. With those upgrades fully integrated, the risk of psychic corruption was now virtually zero. Still, controlling and digesting tailed beast chakra efficiently demanded more power. To become truly seamless at this, Nathan knew he needed to advance to level 7. Fortunately, he could already feel the technique reaching beyond its current limits. He was closer than ever to his next breakthrough. Nathan studied the numbers flowing through his mind's eye. If he kept refining his techniques in this direction and capitalized on the hands-on experience he was accumulating, he could erase his current shortcomings by the time he reached level 7. But there was another problem demanding his attention: his speed and efficiency in drawing chakra from the tailed beast. Previously, when absorbing chakra from ordinary ninja, Nathan could siphon in 2,000 points per second without strain. Now, with the beast's chakra, his intake had plummeted to just 500 points per second, only a quarter of what it used to be. Although 500 points per second wasn't exactly sluggish, he found it far from satisfactory. He resolved to crank that figure upward. His conversion rate had dipped too. Where human chakra had been converted at a perfect 100%, the beast's energy now yielded only about 90%. Nathan reasoned this drop had to do with the chakra's nature. Whether emanating from a human host or a tailed beast, it was essentially the same prime energy, so he shouldn't expect drastically different conversion efficiencies. Without hesitation, he initiated another round of tests right there in the sealed chamber, fine-tuning his chakra receptors. All the while, the six-tails beast imprisoned inside began to stir in agitation. Its chakra, long held in check by the sealing technique, swelled restlessly, threatening to burst its bonds. The vampire's mouth gaped as it ravenously siphoned chakra, its eyes flashing with furious desperation. But rage was useless now. Between Minato Namikaze's dazzling seals and Nathan's own binding techniques, the monster had no opening, no hope of unleashing its ultimate move, the tailed beast Jade. Chapter 573. Hesitation. The Vulpix's anguished roar echoed through the clearing as its fiery tail sputtered and dimmed. Invisible chakra chains bound its limbs, and though it thrashed violently, its strength was ebbing. Nathan focused all his will on the chakra absorption technique. 2 minutes later, he had siphoned 60,000 units of chakra from the exhausted fox. At a conversion efficiency of 90%, that yielded 54,000 units for his own reserves, so much that his chakra pool threatened to burst. Realizing he'd reached his limit, Nathan cut the absorption link without a second thought. He drew in a deep breath, formed a rapid sequence of hand seals, and unleashed the shadow clone technique. In an instant, a swirl of inky smoke billowed around him, and from it emerged 4 perfect duplicates, each bearing his expression and bearing. The price of summoning them was steep. Nathan's original chakra levels dropped sharply, plunging below 30,000 units. He could have ramped up the absorption, but wisdom held him back. Too much too fast, risked a backlash he couldn't afford. He met the eyes of his 4 clones and offered a brief, knowing wink. They mirrored his gesture with synchronized nods. They shared his intent without a single word. Then, as one, they lifted into the air and scattered in different directions. Their mission was clear. Just as Nathan's earlier clones had done, each would find a quiet, secluded spot to practice and refine the freshly absorbed chakra. Only after fully digesting the energy would they reconvene and press on. Nathan watched them go, conviction steady in his chest. Sometimes he reminded himself, the greatest power lay not in reckless speed, but in the patience to grow stronger from within. After the others departed, Nathan shifted his gaze away. Unfazed by Minato Namikaze's curious stare, he formed the sealing hand signs and reactivated his chakra absorption technique, plunging himself once again into the 6 tails' chakra. The tailed beast, still smarting from Nathan's earlier withdrawal, had been gearing up for another assault. But before it could muster enough energy, Nathan began siphoning chakra again, provoking its wrath. A deafening roar echoed as the six tails thrashed in fury. 2 minutes later, Minato's chakra chains snapped taut around the beast, binding it so tightly that every attempt to break free only tightened the restraints. Watching those unbreakable links hold fast, Nathan felt a measure of relief. As he continued to draw in the monster's chakra, he reviewed the fight in his mind, weighing successes against mistakes. One fact stood out above all. He had accomplished the mission's primary goal. This encounter served as a first real-world test of Nathan's new chakra absorption technique on the tailed beasts. He needed to be sure he could actually wield their power, not just claim it. At the same time, he used the battle to gauge how lethal his arsenal of ninjutsu would be against these colossal creatures. What became immediately clear was that, so long as an attack shared the same chakra nature as the target beast, even a basic jutsu could inflict real harm. And when Nathan deployed his heavier firepower, especially forbidden or high-tier techniques like water style, water break wave, and wind style Rasen shuriken, their impact was devastating, potentially fatal if he struck precisely. That hard-won insight, however, was offset by a glaring weakness. He still had no reliable way to control a tailed beast over the long term. As the dust settled, Nathan's eyes fell on the 8 chakra chains that coiled tightly around the six tails' massive form. In the end, he knew he would have to resort to a sealing technique to keep the beast in check. But he was determined not to simply follow in Minato Namikaze's footsteps. He'd find his own path to dominance over the tailed beasts. If all goes as planned, once Nathan settles the Danzo affair, he'll gain access to a substantial inheritance. That windfall could fill in all his gaps, especially his underdeveloped de-sealing technique, and free him from owing anyone a favor. Debts are always harder to repay than skills are to master, and Nathan would much rather depend on his own strength than bind himself to a teacher. Thoughts raced through his mind as he tried to dissect the battle he'd just fought, but there was almost nothing to analyze. The clash had ended far sooner than anyone expected. Although Nathan had been assigned a supporting role, a single impulse had brought the entire fight to a sudden close. He found himself as astonished as Minato Namikaze, the operation's designated lead. Besides drawing the six-tailed fox's attention and holding it at bay just long enough for Nathan to execute the sealing jutsu, Minato's contribution had been minimal, and the rest of the team never even faced the beast. Minato Namikaze, known far and wide as the Yellow Flash, was as much a master strategist as he was an assassin. Beyond his extraordinary speed and battle intuition, his greatest asset lay in the summoning technique, calling upon the toads of Mount Myoboku to turn the tide of any confrontation. Yet in his very first clash with the Six Tails, he never even had a moment to perform a single summoning. The fight concluded too swiftly. That, however, in no way reflected an underpowered opponent. On the contrary, it was the enemy's final gambit, a perfectly timed sealing jutsu, that proved decisive, successfully subduing the beast. Earlier in that same battle, Nathan had unleashed his trademark wind style, Rasen shuriken, striking the Six Tails with devastating force. The impact left the creature crippled, at least for an instant. But tailed beasts are not human, and their regenerative abilities run far deeper. With a single, labored breath, the Six Tails began to heal. From that point on, it might never reach its former peak strength, but even in a weakened state, it remained an overwhelming threat for both Nathan and Minato Namikaze. Nathan watched as Minato Namikaze seized the moment, refusing to give the six-tailed beast, still flickering with residual chakra, a chance to gather itself. With a single swift move, Minato activated the Flying Thunder God technique, teleporting behind the creature, and immediately followed up with his sealing technique. The battle ended as abruptly as it had begun. Without Minato's decisive intervention and the unwavering support of his shadow clones, the fight might have dragged on for hours. Nathan could already see that Minato's role was far more than mere assistance. As that thought crossed his mind, the six-tailed beast staggered under the weight of the seals. In low, resonant unison, Minato and his 3 shadow clones intoned, "Seal!" 8 glowing chakra chains erupted from their open palms. The sealing talismans over them blazed to life, writhing like living serpents as they sprang toward the beast. A deafening roar shook the clearing. Then, with a final flash of light, the six-tailed beast was gone. Nathan's hand closed on empty air. Blinking, he looked down at the spot where the monster had stood, and instead beheld a small boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old. The child's sleek black hair framed a surprisingly handsome face, but his clothes were tattered, threadbare, even more ragged than a beggar's tunic. Yet in that instant, Nathan knew that appearances didn't begin to tell the whole story. Nathan activated his Sharingan and stared at the fallen figure before him. Even through the haze of unconsciousness, the boy's exposed skin was corroded. Acid had eaten away at flesh and muscle. Every few seconds, the child's whole body trembled, as if he were trapped in some invisible agony. Nathan didn't need to think twice. This was the Six Tails Jinchuriki, Yugao. Seeing the boy in such a miserable state, Nathan finally understood why the Jinchuriki harbored so much resentment toward the Shinobi villages. On one hand, they were shunned by their own people. On the other, they were treated as nothing more than living weapons. A few paces away, Namikaze Minato frowned at the same sight. With a swift and seal, he produced a shadow clone and sent it forward to inspect the injured Jinchuriki. Minato's usually steady gaze betrayed an unusual hesitation. Before leaving Konoha's gates, Hiruzen Sarutobi had made one thing clear: capture the target alive and bring him back. Yet now, faced with this child so broken and defenseless, Minato felt a tug of sympathy. On a purely strategic level, holding the Six Tails hostage would force the Hidden Mist village to come to the negotiating table. After all, they had already lost the Three Tails. Surrendering the Six Tails was out of the question. Still, could he bring himself to treat Yugao as nothing more than a bargaining chip? Minato shook his head, struggling to silence the doubt stirring in his chest. Minato Namikaze's gaze drifted to the trembling form of Nathan, and in that instant, he thought of Uzumaki Kushina. Both were Jinchuriki, bound by the same cruel fate. Not long ago, Kushina herself had nearly been sent to Kirigakure on a similar mission. Minato shuddered at the thought of what the Mist Village's hidden torture chambers might have done to her. How broken she must have felt in their hands. And then there was Nathan, a child even younger than Kushina had been when her ordeal began. How terrified, how desperate he would grow if he were dragged off to Kirigakure's dungeons. True, there was a good chance the Mist Shinobi would eventually return him to Konoha in exchange for one of their own prisoners. But the scars left on his mind, those could last a lifetime. Yet Minato couldn't ignore the larger picture. Handing Nathan over might well force the Mist Village to sue for peace, ending the war, and saving countless lives in both nations. Sacrifice one to spare many. It seemed a straightforward, even noble choice. And still, Minato hesitated. Chapter 574, Counterstrike and Departure. Minato Namikaze teetered between duty and desire. Should he deliver the unconscious Yugao back to Konoha, or follow his heart and let her go free? His hesitation was cut short by a subtle ripple in space. From high above, Nathan's sharp gaze picked up the distortion the instant it appeared. A moment later, a plume of chakra smoke exploded around Yugao's limp form, and when it cleared, she had vanished. Nathan's conclusion was immediate. This had to be the work of Kirigakure. Despite their outward restraint during the raid, the Hidden Mist was clearly bent on provoking a major incident. With the only remaining tailed beast hosts on the field, they still possessed powerful contingencies. This sudden abduction was their counterstrike. No ordinary jutsu could create such a fleeting spatial fluctuation. Only the profound depths of psychic arts, or their equally rare counterpsychic variants, could warp reality so briefly, and the ghost of that distortion confirmed it. Hovering in the sky, Nathan offered Minato a faint, inscrutable glance. Even from this height, he'd sensed the space-time quiver before it fully unfolded, a testament to his ever-watchful vigilance. Nathan couldn't believe that Namikaze Minato, who had perfected the Flying Thunder God technique to such an extraordinary degree, would fail to sense Yugao's teleportation. Given the space between them and Minato's legendary reflexes, Nathan was certain Minato could have intercepted Yugao long before he disappeared. After all, the special kunai used with Flying Thunder God were known to tear through and seal off pockets of space. If Minato's timing was off, he could always place a teleportation mark on his opponent's body at the last moment, preventing any escape. Yet to Nathan's astonishment, Minato simply stood there as Yugao vanished. Such passivity was unheard of for a Konoha shinobi. Even the normally mild-mannered third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, would bristle at hearing this. And as for the radicals watching from the shadows, they were openly eager to take down Minato, and that threat was far from imaginary. Remember Hatake Sakukun, the legendary White Fang of Konoha? He was driven to his death by nothing more than public outrage over a single mission. Now imagine if every casualty and injury on the Kirigakure battlefield were blamed on Minato Namikaze. Stoke the grief of those families, fan the flames of their anger, and you could turn the entire village against him overnight. Thousands would call for his head. If Minato's mind wasn't rock steady, they could break him, perhaps even drive him to suicide. At the very least, his reputation would lie in ruins. Minato frowned. That all depends on people finding out in the first place. Nathan, his unusual companion, half bird, half flower, tilted his head. His petals fluttered with a faint glow. As long as I don't tell a soul, no one does. He paused, studying Minato for a few more seconds. Then, with a single powerful beat of his wings, he launched himself into the sky and vanished in the direction he'd come. Minato exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing. Watching Nathan's retreating form, he realized just how close he'd come to being undone, and how much he owed to that silent promise. Although Minato Namikaze and Nathan never spoke of it directly, Minato was confident Nathan would guard their secret, and that confidence spared him a great deal of headache. He didn't mind if rumors reached the village ears, but if this matter could stay hidden, he preferred it. Not out of vanity or fear of gossip, but to ensure nothing distracted him from his true goal, becoming the fourth Hokage. His pursuit of that office wasn't driven by a hunger for power, but by conviction that only from its seat could he reshape things for the better. Chosen by Jiraiya as the child of prophecy, Minato harbored lofty ideals and knew precisely what he wanted, and what he'd have to pay to get it. Nathan's silhouette drifted upward against the twilight sky, and Minato stayed rooted in place, watching Nang until the last wisp of his friend vanished. At that moment, his resolve crystallized. When the war between Konoha and Kirigakure finally erupted, he would not command from behind the lines. He would fight at the front, using his own hands to save every life that hung in the balance because of his decisions. This was the promise of Namikaze Minato. Nathan knew Minato might make choices that weren't always best for the village, yet he would willingly shoulder the consequences and work tirelessly to see them through. Nathan couldn't claim to understand Minato's mind, or even if he did, to really care. Some people instinctively carry heavy burdens, sacrificing themselves for their ideals. Nathan wouldn't become that kind of person, but he deeply respected those who did. After all, history needs its leaders. Perhaps if they ever crossed paths again, he might be able to repay the debt in some small way. For now, though, he had his own duties to focus on. Not long afterward, Nathan soared back to the heart of the battlefield. The skirmish still raged. He hesitated, wondering if he should jump in, but then he saw the mist shinobi receiving orders. They clustered around each jonin, formed into squads, and slipped away in different directions. The Konoha Shinobi watched them go, but made no move to pursue. The toll of the recent fighting had left everyone utterly spent. Even with Uchiha Shisui and the others on the field, the battle had swung in our favor only marginally. Our position was still dangerously precarious. After a brief council, Shisui decided to send a small, swift detachment to shadow the retreating mist ninjas. Their mission was twofold: keep those rogue shinobi from stirring up trouble behind the lines, and harry them enough to buy precious time for the reinforcements marching to our aid. If the opportunity arose, they would even attempt to encircle the enemy and knock them out in one decisive strike. In truth, Nathan and his squad were merely the vanguard of the relief force bound for the Red Tree stronghold. Several other units trailed not far behind, tasked with rebuilding the stronghold and establishing a permanent garrison. But if the situation demanded it, they, too, could pivot mid-journey to join the hunt for any mist operatives who slipped through our front. As the only one among us able to fly, Nathan was naturally chosen to lead the pursuit from above, yet he knew better than to expend all his strength at once. Seizing a quiet moment, he formed a shadow clone and sent it racing ahead to scout the enemy's retreat. With his duplicate taking on the surveillance, Nathan returned to his training, focusing on digesting the chakra still coursing through his veins so that he'd be battle-ready for whatever lay ahead. Nathan knew that the only way to reclaim the chakra he'd invested in his shadow clones was to recapture them before dispelling the shadow clone technique and absorb their energy back into his original body. He could have simply allowed his clones to exhaust themselves until they vanished, instantaneously returning all their chakra in one go, but that would squander a wealth of hard-earned experience. By retrieving each clone in turn, Nathan could immediately convert their training logs and battle memories into permanent increases in skill proficiency, thanks to the once certified, forever certified feature of his proficiency panel. This method maximized his growth and ensured none of his chakra went to waste. Although chakra was plentiful for someone of his talent, Nathan refused to squander even a drop. Every moment counted, and he was determined to squeeze the most out of every practice session. Chapter 575, Sunset's End and Promotion. Nathan sat by a flickering bonfire, deep in a sparsely populated jungle. The sky had bled from sunset's fiery red into the cool silver of moonlight. He closed his eyes and drew in a steady breath, ready to assimilate the memories and experiences his shadow clone had just harvested. Tonight, every drop of chakra mattered, and he would convert each bit into raw proficiency. Silence settled around him, broken only by the crackle of burning wood. Minutes stretched into hours as Nathan methodically sifted through nearly 400,000 units of chakra, discarding nothing. When he finally opened his eyes, a quiet smile tugged at his lips. "Done," he whispered, exhaling in relief. All processed. True to his plan, he had split the recovered chakra evenly between two critical techniques. First, the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique surged by 1,200 points, vaulting its mastery from level 5, 625,000, to level 5, 1,935,000. Even more dramatic was the advance in his chakra feather robe, which shot up by 1,800 points, from level 5, 2,335,000, to level 5, 455,000. Nathan closed his eyes again, basking in the quiet triumph. The jungle night pressed in around him, but inside he already felt the stirrings of his next breakthrough. Nathan's next objective was clear: to shatter the current 20,000, 50,000 barrier of his Sharingan evolution and fully unlock its spiritual attribute. He'd set out at dawn, convinced that today would be the day he finally pushed past his limit. Over the past few hours, Nathan had strained every muscle and nerve to absorb the extra chakra, all while maintaining his rigorous training schedule, especially the reflection heart technique, without so much as a moment's rest. Now, standing on the brink of the final phase, he braced himself for the breakthrough. Just as he prepared to initiate the last set of hand seals, a sudden cascade of memories burst into his consciousness. Instantly, Nathan abandoned the reflection heart technique and focused on sifting through these newly acquired images. They weren't his own recollections, but those of the shadow clone he'd sent out on the surveillance mission. The footage was extensive, far more than he'd expected, and it took Nathan several minutes to digest it all. Only then did he realize the mission was over. The clone had not only gathered its intelligence, but had already compiled a full report and analysis. In fact, as soon as its assignment concluded and it began the return journey to the Blackstone base, the shadow clone technique had naturally dissolved, and with it, the final piece of information he needed. Nathan leaned against a log, staring into the night. In his memory, only one Kirigakure squad had managed to slip away after scattering in every direction. The rest had been cut down or captured by Konoha's reinforcements. From the village's point of view, the losses were harsh, but not crippling. Kirigakure's assault, backed by the six-tailed fox, had destroyed a base and claimed many lives, but the shinobi Konoha dispatched had inflicted an equally steep toll. All told, the outcome was acceptable. Having reviewed the battle's results in his mind, Nathan set aside further thought of it. He settled himself beside the dying campfire, crossed his legs, and began the final stage of the reflection heart technique. The low crackle of burning wood blended with his steady breaths. With each two-cycle repetition, roughly 2 minutes, the power of his Sharingan inched forward. The progress was slow, but rock solid, every tiny advance reassuring him that he was on the verge of breaking through this last barrier. Time passed in measured beats. 30 minutes later, the last bit of experience crystallized, pushing Nathan's Sharingan past the 20,000-point mark on its 50,000-point path. Without warning, his eyes flared as the Mangekyo Sharingan burst open. A surge of ocular chakra washed through him, probing the recesses of his mind and funneling raw power back into his spirit. Nathan felt his spiritual attributes swell in response, so intensely had he lost himself in the sensation. 5 minutes slipped by before the growth finally tapered off. He blinked, centering himself, then willed his proficiency panel into view. Instantly, the familiar pale blue interface shimmered before him, ready to display his latest stats. Nathan Uchiha, age 12. Nathan stared at the translucent status panel hovering before him. Every figure, every bar, represented hours of training, battles barely survived, and power yet to be mastered. Physique, 20. Spirit, 21. Chakra, 149,236, up from 138,868. Sharingan Mangekyo. Progress, 20,000, 50,000. Buy-in, unawakened, 4,100. Skills, Chakra Refining Level 5, 3,182, 5,000. Wind Style Rasen Shuriken. 7, 10,211, 20,000. Wind Style Vacuum Blade Level 1. Wind Style Vacuum Ball of 1, 10,200. Wind Style, Wind Devourer. Level 1 to 100. Fire Style, Great Dragon Fire Technique. Level 5, 4,001, 5,000. Water Style, Great Shark Bullet Technique. Level 7, 4,380, 20,000. Water Style, Water Array Pillar. Level 6, 5,510, 10,000. Water Style, Water Break Wave. Level 6, 2,750 tenzins. Water Style, Water Explosion Wave over 1, 100. Earth Style, Earth Flow Wall. Level 6, 7,700, 10,000. Lightning Style, Lightning Body. Level 1, 2,200. Multiple Shadow Clone Technique. Level 7, 1,080, 2,000. Shuriken Clone Technique. Level 5, 1,830, 5,000. Chakra Absorption Technique. Level 6, 8,200, 10,000. Rasengan. Level 8, 13,015. Chakra Feather Cloak. Level 5, 4,150, 5,000. Chakra Scalpel. Level 7, 1,750, 20,000. Microscopic Extraction Technique. Level 6, 4,200 Tendon. Heart Reflection Technique. Level 8, 29,539, 50,000. Chakra Control. Level 6, 2,510. Guardian Seal. 2,066 Intensive Sealing Array. Level 4, 1,017, 2,000. Perfect Skills. Wind Style, Wind Wings. Level 7. Fire Style, Unburned. Level 7. Only a little bit? Nathan muttered, eyebrows knitting together as he took in the small jump in spirit. 1 point. It felt like a drop in the ocean compared to what he'd poured his sweat into, but every advantage counted in a world where power decided fate. Nathan had assumed that once his Sharingan evolved past the 20,000, 50,000 threshold, the boost would skyrocket, but in truth, it only ticked upward by a small margin. Yet that modest number belied a substantial gain. By Nathan's calculations, his mental power is now at least 1.5 times what it was at the 20-point mark, a full 50% increase. His earlier misjudgment came from underestimating how each attribute point magnifies after breaking 20. In the past, additional points yielded only limited returns, but this time the jump far surpassed anything he'd seen before. So the seemingly minor rise in his spirit attribute didn't trouble him. Instead, Nathan dove into testing exactly how much this new spiritual strength had enhanced his abilities. Nathan felt a familiar thrill as his potential surged once more. His chakra ceiling had jumped from 500,000 points to 600,000, a full 100,000-point increase. Admittedly, it wasn't quite as dramatic as the 110,000-point boost he'd received last time, when his physique attribute finally caught up with his spiritual attribute and they balanced each other perfectly. Still, a 6-figure rise was nothing to scoff at. Even more important to Nathan than the raw increase in capacity was the acceleration of his chakra recovery. After all, he could sit at his new theoretical maximum all day, but unless he could regenerate chakra more quickly, his real-world power wouldn't improve. Daily gains depended on how much chakra he could restore in a given period, and that restoration rate hinged on two factors: the efficiency of his chakra refinement technique and his own natural recovery speed. Since the refinement technique's level hadn't changed, the amount of chakra he could recover per hour remained the same. The breakthrough this time lay entirely in his body's innate regeneration. Soon, Nathan thought, that too would become a force to be reckoned with. Nathan's recent boost in spiritual attribute didn't raise his physical endurance, so he could still only run the chakra refining technique 18 hours a day. That meant the daily chakra he recovered through the technique remained the same. What really mattered now was his natural regeneration. He closed his eyes, paused the refining process, and settled into meditation. 30 minutes later, Nathan opened his eyes and studied the chakra readout on his display panel. His natural daily recovery had soared from 350,000 points to 430,000 points, an 80,000-point gain. It wasn't quite as dramatic as the 100,000-point jump he'd seen after his physical attribute first broke 20, but that had been a special case when his body and spirit realigned perfectly. Even so, when he combined the 430,000 points of natural regeneration with the 36,000 points he earned by running the chakra refining technique for 18 hours, Nathan's total usable chakra each day reached a staggering 466,000 points. Clearly, unless Nathan manages to gain control of a tailed beast, his regular chakra battery won't be able to keep pace with his rapid growth. After all, he's looking at nearly 500,000 chakra points to spend every single day, and without a small army of suppliers to loot from, there's simply no other way to maintain that level of output. In the end, he has to depend on himself. Nathan let out a low, thoughtful sigh and began to plan exactly how he would allocate this massive influx of chakra. Chapter 576, Allocation and Testing. 80,000 chakra points wasn't a trivial sum, but it wasn't limitless either. Nathan studied his status panel, weighing how best to distribute them. At first glance, he noticed that the Byakugan entry sat under his spiritual attribute. He'd assumed that raising spiritual wouldn't affect his awakening level, but the panel told a different story. Fusing with the Byakugan had been more than a mere physical integration. It had deepened his spiritual connection as well. As a result, boosting spiritual now did raise his awakening, albeit modestly, from 3,100 up to 4,100. A 10-point jump wasn't enormous, but Nathan was more than satisfied. At least he didn't have to wait for his physique attribute to catch up before advancing. With his mind made up, he allocated the chakra points to spiritual, watched the numbers climb, and flexed his control over the new power. Taking a deep breath, Nathan reached up to the small seal at the center of his brow, the guardian seal. He focused, felt the familiar pressure there, and released it. In an instant, both of his eyes snapped open, the world around him shimmering into the pale, almost crystalline clarity of the Byakugan. Every movement, every heartbeat, within a full kilometer radius, was laid bare before him. Nathan held the vision for a moment, letting the flood of information wash over him. The distant panting of a fox, the faint tremor of an underground stream, even the suppressed breath of a spider hidden in a cave wall. Satisfied with the test, he relaxed his concentration and closed his eyes, sealing the Byakugan once more. The exercise had gone perfectly. Nathan could feel his power growing stronger, his senses keener. Now came the real challenge, putting it all to use. Nathan felt a surge of satisfaction as he realized his Byakugan's awakening level had just increased. With each activation, it now consumed even less chakra. He allowed himself a small, pleased grin. "Excellent," he murmured. Turning back to the status panel hovering before him, he scrolled through his repertoire of skills. Chakra Refining Technique, Level 5, 3,882 5,000. He was tantalizingly close to Level 6, yet this technique only granted 18 proficiency points per day, and there was no way to pour extra chakra into it for a speed boost. Progress would have to come with time. Wind Style, Rasen Shuriken, fully invested. Ever since mastering Wind Style, Wind Wings, and Fire Style, Sugiyaki Technique, he'd banked a total of 60,000 chakra points into this skill. It now gained 400 proficiency points daily on its own. Further investment would yield diminishing returns. The same logic applied to his other major jutsu. Water Style, Great Shark Bullet Technique. Water Style, Water Array Pillar. Water Style, Water Break Wave. Earth Style, Earth Flow Wall. Multiple Shadow Clone Technique. Rasengan. All of them already had tens of thousands of chakra points committed, each accumulating proficiency automatically every day. Nathan tapped his chin thoughtfully. For now, it was enough. He'd let these techniques mature naturally, then focus his efforts elsewhere. He exhaled slowly, eyes shining with resolve. With his Byakugan more powerful than ever and his primary skills steadily advancing, he was ready for the challenges ahead. Nathan scanned his skill menu. At this stage, all but two abilities, the multiple shadow clone technique and the Rasengan, could be upgraded in the near future. His water style, Great Shark Bullet Technique, sat at level 7, 14,380, 20,000 proficiency. By pouring in 57,000 chakra points each day, he gained 380 proficiency points, meaning he'd reach level 8 in roughly 2 weeks. He then checked his other 3 elemental jutsu. Water style, Water Array Pillar, was level 6, 5,510, 10,000. Water style, Water Breaking Wave, was level 6, 2,750, 10,000. And Earth style, Earth Flow Wall, was also level 6, 7,700, 10,000. Allocating 30,000 chakra points daily among them yielded 300 proficiency points across the board. At that rate, Terra Ray Pillar would ascend in 15 days, Water Breaking Wave in 25 days, and Earth Flow Wall in 8 days. Since each technique only required a matter of days to advance, Nathan decided against pouring in any extra chakra. His current plan would see him fully prepared well before he needed to rely on those upgraded skills. After finishing his daily chakra sweep, Nathan took stock of his new and existing jutsu. His freshly acquired water style, exploding water wave, and the 3 wind style techniques he'd already learned, vacuum jade, vacuum blade, and wind devouring, all at level 1, demanded far more chakra than he could spare in combat against his current opponents. The only way to make them battle-worthy was to raise their levels. Since each of these was ranked B level, Nathan estimated, based on past experience, that about 1 proficiency point required roughly 100 chakra points. He chose to allocate his daily gain of 80,000 chakra evenly across the 4 skills. That meant dedicating 20,000 chakra to each technique every day, yielding around 200 proficiency points apiece. In the early stages, that rate of growth would be more than sufficient. He also planned ahead. As these jutsu advanced and the cost of further improvement rose, he could redirect chakra toward the 3 other techniques nearing completion. Water style, Water Formation Pillar, Water style, Water Breaking Wave, and Earth style, Earth Flow Wall, without falling behind. In this way, none of his abilities would be delayed in reaching their full potential. Nathan tapped the side of his display panel with satisfaction. It had been 18 days since his physique attribute last advanced, and in roughly 40 more days, his body would once again approach a critical transformation. When that change completed, his physique would jump yet another level, granting him tens of thousands of chakra points each day and accelerating the progress of all his skills. For now, he just allocated the latest 80,000 chakra points across his 4 core abilities. That left his Shuriken Shadow Clone Technique and Chakra Feather Robe powerless to improve, unless he siphoned chakra directly from the battlefield. Thankfully, the current war would rage on for some time yet, so cutting off his chakra supply wasn't a concern. Besides, both techniques had already reached level 5, more than adequate for the challenges ahead. Satisfied with his distribution plan, Nathan closed the panel. He tilted his head from side to side, joints clicking, then pushed himself to his feet. The next stage of the conflict awaited, and with a fresh chakra reserve on the horizon, he felt ready for whatever came. When he reactivated his Byakugan and confirmed he was completely alone, Nathan closed it and immediately triggered his Sharingan. In an instant, 3 inky tomoe spiraled into view in each iris, Coalescing into a brooding black sun, he had awakened the Mangekyo Sharingan. But he wasn't finished yet. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled with deliberate calm, clearing his mind. Channeling the Sharingan's raw power, he unleashed its ultimate technique, Susanoo. At first, a towering silver-white half-skeleton materialized around him, the first stage of the avatar. Until now, that had been his limit. Yet Nathan's Sharingan evolution had just surpassed 20,000 out of 50,000, granting him access to the second stage. A searing pain shot through his body, but he clenched his fists and focused. Veins of chakra snaked over the skeletal frame, weaving flesh and sinew along its bones. Finally, a translucent layer of chakra skin slid over the form, locking the structure into place. In that moment, the second stage of Susanoo stood fully forged, a fearsome testament to Nathan's ever-growing power. Nathan could feel the raw power surging through him, and with it came an unshakable sense of security. For a fleeting instant, he even dared to imagine he might seize a tailed beast chakra for himself. Alarmed by his own bold thought, he immediately chastised himself for getting ahead of reality. Taki, gnawing a steadying breath, Nathan focused his will and brought his Susanoo fully under control. He raised his right arm, and at that moment, 3 enormous Magatama, each forged from condensed chakra, blasted forth like cannonballs. They thundered across the field and slammed into a distant knoll, sending rock and earth flying. This was no ordinary jutsu. It was the Yasaka Magatama, an awe-inspiring ninjutsu granted only when Susanoo reaches its second stage of development. Chapter 577, Return and Message Boom. Boom, boom. 3 deafening explosions rang out in rapid succession. A distant rise was pulverized by 3 colossal Magatama, collapsing into clouds of rubble that rained down in every direction. Even more astonishing was the devastation wrought along the Magatama's flight paths. As each orb tore through the forest, flowers, trees, snakes, insects, even ants and rats, vanished instantly, leaving behind 3 gaping corridors through the undergrowth. Nathan's feet trembled against the tremors pulsing through the earth. He now understood why Susanoo was called the power of the gods. This display far surpassed the might of any ordinary ninja technique. Until now, he had assumed that Yasaka Magatama, Susanoo's mid-level form, was comparable to a standard A-rank ninjutsu. He had sorely underestimated it. A single Magatama might pack the punch of an A-rank jutsu, but unleashing 3 in swift succession was not simply A plus A plus A. The destructive synergy was on an entirely different level, truly divine power made manifest. The combined effect was far more devastating than casting several A-rank ninjutsu in succession. Most shinobi were fragile by comparison, and a technique capable of widespread destruction was their natural enemy, much like facing a tailed beast or other massive summons. Every strike carried the potential for catastrophic damage, making it exceptionally dangerous. At present, Nathan could only launch 3 Magatama at once. Undoubtedly, the more he unleashed, the greater the power would be, but he refused to be discouraged. After all, even Uchiha Madara, the pinnacle of the Uchiha clan, managed 14 at a time. Prodigies like Itachi could only muster 4. Nathan was certain that 3 was not his limit. As his chakra reserves swelled and his mastery of Susanoo deepened, he would be able to fire even more. With that confidence, he spent the next while rigorously testing every facet of Susanoo's second stage. Only after he fully understood its strengths and limits did he withdraw the technique. Then, he let out a long, steady breath. Relieved, Nathan closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the calm before the next challenge. Nathan winced against the invisible strain that rippled through his limbs the moment Susanoo flared to life. Its power was unrivaled, but the toll it took on his body was just as formidable. Even with his physique now rated at 20 points, a searing ache reminded him that he was still only human. He forced himself to breathe deeply. If he intended to rely on Susanoo as a trump card, he couldn't afford to be crippled by pain every time he used it. The solution was clear. He had to grow stronger, both in body and in will. He let that resolve steady him as he knelt beside the dying bonfire and snuffed out its embers. Then, fingertips brushing together, he molded chakra and unleashed the wind technique he'd been perfecting. Wind release, wings of gale. Pale blue currents snapped into existence behind his shoulders, unfolding like feathered appendages. With a single powerful thrust, he lifted off the ground. High above the forest canopy, Nathan hovered for a moment, scanning the treetops for any sign of watchers. Satisfied that he was still alone, he sealed a second-hand sign and drew a cloak of chakra around himself. The light blue aura shimmered into a fine, feather-like mesh, chakra feather garb. With his wings still beating, it both lightened and reinforced his frame, readying him for the journey ahead. He angled forward and accelerated, the wind rushing past him as he darted northward. Below, the trees blurred into streaks of green. Over the next 10 minutes, he raced at full tilt until the familiar ramparts of the Blackstone stronghold rose into view. As the fortress's dark walls came into focus, Nathan let his wings slow, preparing to land and face whatever challenge awaited him there. Nathan bowed politely to Sano Nobuhisa and made his way home, eager to resume his training. Although he'd only just achieved a significant breakthrough, he knew better than to let up now. Today's regimen still awaited completion. Thankfully, Sano Nobuhisa, mindful of Nathan's recent success, had given him the evening off from missions. That meant he could drill uninterrupted until late into the night. Before dawn, he was back on his feet. After a quick breakfast, a messenger arrived with Sano's orders. As in the past few days, Nathan was to deploy his shadow clone technique, then patrol the perimeter of the Blackstone stronghold, gathering any battlefield intelligence he could find, and to relay his reports at a moment's notice. On top of that, he was to stand ready to support Sano's frontline shinobi whenever needed. It was clear why Sano had altered Nathan's duties. After days of relentless fighting, the frontline ninjas were running on fumes. Without their exhaustion, Nathan would have stuck strictly to reconnaissance, his original assignment at the war's outset. But desperate times called for flexibility. With his shadow clones at the ready, he would not only scout but also back up any comrades who needed an extra hand. Nathan didn't hesitate. He needed to harvest chakra from the Mist Ninja, and a direct assault promised the quickest payoff. After double-checking his gear and supplies, he activated Wind Style, Wind Wings, and soared into the sky. Once aloft, he formed 4 shadow clones, one for each quadrant, sending them northeast, southeast, southwest, and northwest to scout the battlefield. With his initial clones dispatched beyond enemy lines, Nathan's original body produced one more shadow clone to handle routine tasks. While that clone slipped in and out of the fray searching for chakra-rich targets, Nathan himself drifted to the battlefield's edge to practice new techniques in relative safety. The clone was instructed to use the heart communication technique the moment it found a promising mist ninja. At that signal, Nathan would swoop back in, eliminate the target, and claim the chakra for himself. Over the past week, Nathan had grown completely accustomed to the battle routine. By the time the skirmishes resumed, nothing felt unfamiliar. Yet, the Mist Ninja attacks had grown even more relentless than before, despite Konoha's successful defense against one of their recent schemes. It was no wonder the frontline shinobi were on edge. Kirigakure's tactics had become almost suicidal. More than once, Nathan's shadow clone had to spring into action to bolster the defenses. Thankfully, he still had enough chakra reserves to sustain those clones, though barely. 2 days later, the entire battlefield fell eerily silent that night. The reason was simple. Today, negotiations between Konoha and Iwagakure had finally concluded, and neither side expected the outcome to change. With the talks wrapped up, Kirigakure saw no advantage in launching fresh assaults. All that remained was to await the official decision. The next morning, the conference room inside Blackstone Stronghold filled with Konoha's top shinobi, an assembly rarely seen all at once. A hush fell over the group when footsteps echoed in the corridor. Moments later, Sano Nobuhisa pushed open the door and entered, drawing every eye in the room. A long, suppressed smile finally spread across Nathan's face. Stepping to the front of the room, he announced, "I bring good news. Our village has concluded peace talks with the Hidden Rock Village. As of today, both sides will cease hostilities." Immediately, the conference room exploded in excited chatter. Although many had guessed a favorable outcome when they first saw Sano Nobuhisa's confident expression, hearing the confirmation firsthand sent a surge of relief and joy through everyone present. First, the truce with the Hidden Sand Village. Now this. Peace was drawing ever closer, and no one could contain their happiness. Nathan alone remained composed, his face serious. He felt no surprise at the result. In the memories of his previous life, the Hidden Rock Village had always signed a peace treaty with Konoha. Furthermore, over the past 10 days, the Hidden Mist Lodge had failed to break through Konoha's eastern defenses, making a ceasefire all but inevitable. What puzzled him was not the agreement itself, but why the Hidden Rock Village had delayed the final negotiations for an entire 10 days. The aim wasn't merely to apply pressure on the Hidden Mist Village, but also to send a clear message to its radicals. Given that Konoha has held firm under these conditions, it's obvious the Hidden Rock Village stands no chance of winning this war. In such circumstances, the only sensible course is mutual compromise. Chapter 578, Thoughts and Speculations. All right, everyone, quiet down for a moment. Nobuhisa Sano clapped his hands to call the room to order. Where moments ago had been bustling celebration fell instantly silent. Sano's usual easy smile faded, replaced by a hard edge of concern. The assembled shinobi exchanged uneasy glances, bracing themselves. Clearing his throat, Sano spoke in a measured, somber tone. Village reports confirm that, although we've agreed in principle to a ceasefire with Iwagakure, the formal treaty won't be signed for another week. A whole week? Someone muttered. A collective frown swept the room. Everyone recognized how strange it was. Either a ceasefire gets sealed immediately, or the fighting drags on. Delaying the paperwork for 7 days smacked of bad faith. Sano paced slowly in front of the long council table, folding his arms as he studied the faces turned toward him. We need to treat that delay as a warning, he continued. Iwagakure is stalling for time, maybe to regroup, reinforce, or wait for some advantage. Until that ink dries, they're free to maneuver. We can't afford complacency. Nathan, formerly known as Ching Ming, leaned forward, rubbing his chin. If they're buying themselves time, we should be doing the same. Send scouts to shadow their supply lines, reinforce our northern border. Sano nodded. Exactly. I'm assigning teams to those tasks right now. And everyone else, stay sharp. Assume their ceasefire offer is only as good as the moment it's signed. A tense murmur ran through the room as the council members absorbed the news. The week ahead would be critical. Every decision, every deployment could tip the balance between lasting peace and renewed conflict. And with Iwagakure's true intentions still hidden, Nathan and the others knew they couldn't lower their guard for even a single day. Nathan sighed as he reviewed the latest schedule. After 4 grueling rounds of talks spread over 20 days, the ceasefire had finally been agreed upon, but the actual signing was now pushed back another week. It all felt like far more hassle than it was worth. No one here could explain why Iwagakure was dragging its feet, but Nathan had his suspicions. The simplest answer was internal dissent. A vocal faction within the Hidden Rock Village opposed any truce, and Elder Onoki, despite his ironclad authority and enormous prestige, had been forced into a reluctant compromise. Onoki could veto outsiders, but he couldn't simply steamroll his own council. At the same time, Konoha negotiators made it clear they wouldn't tolerate an open-ended delay. In the end, the 10-day stall plus the new 1-week hold was almost certainly the product of a 3-way tug-of-war between Onoki, his hardliners, and the Leaf delegates. Nathan frowned as he considered the wider picture. It wasn't only Iwagakure's radicals holding things up. In his previous lifetime, he'd seen how Danzo Shimura had covertly sabotaged peace efforts during the Fourth Great Ninja War. At the conflict's close, Danzo had sent root operatives disguised as enemy shinobi to incite violence in the already volatile Rain Country, turning a fragile ceasefire into an explosive powder keg. If ghosts from the past were still at large, no one could predict just how far they'd go to keep the war alive. Nathan couldn't shake the memory that even Yahiko, the Akatsuki's founding leader, had fallen to this traitor's machinations. And then it hit him. This was his best chance. The conspirator would soon be joining forces with Hanzo to strike at the Akatsuki, which meant they'd inevitably step into the Rain Country. All Nathan had to do was keep an eye on the hidden Rain Village's movements, cross-reference them with any Akatsuki activity, and he'd uncover the traitor's trail. With his own skills, confronting the culprit would be easy. His pulse raced at the thought, but he forced himself to calm down and weigh the risks. It wasn't Hanzo's strength that worried him. At this point, Hanzo still carried himself with the proud dignity of a hero. He was formidable, yes, but not beyond Nathan's reach. Even in defeat, Nathan's life wouldn't be forfeit. And Nagato? He remained under Yahiko's protection, barely scratching the surface of the Rinnegan's powers. The full might of the Samsara Eye hadn't awakened yet, so there was little to fear there. Nathan allowed himself a steadying breath. All the pieces were falling into place, and soon he would have his vengeance. Why did Nathan walk away from such an obvious opportunity? The answer was simple. The brewing conflict between the Akatsuki and the Hidden Rain village had drawn far too much attention. Both Uchiha Obito and Black Zetsu were quietly watching every development, and Nathan had no wish to expose his true capabilities to either of them. Reluctantly, he let the chance slip away, at least for now. With a soft sigh, Nathan pushed that disappointment aside and turned his thoughts to the 1-week buffer Sano Nobuhisa had mentioned. That interval was clearly Onoki's safety valve for the radicals in the Rain Village. During these 7 days, the hardliners would inevitably try to sow chaos. If Konoha could neutralize their disruptions swiftly and cleanly, the dissenting voices in the Hidden Rain would fade, and the peace treaty would proceed on schedule. But the moment Konoha revealed a misstep or was forced into a public blunder, Onoki would have every reason to renege on the negotiations. The treaty would collapse, and the Hidden Rain village would emerge demanding far greater concessions. Nathan couldn't allow that to happen, no matter how tempting the immediate opportunity might have been. The next week would prove absolutely critical for Konoha. The conflict in the Rain Country wasn't merely a showdown between us and Iwagakure. It also risked drawing Kirigakure into the fray. Last time, the Hidden Mist lent a hand to the Stone Village, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't do so again. Over the past fortnight, Iwagakure's full-scale assault had dealt Konoha serious wounds, but they had suffered grievous losses of their own. Nathan found himself wondering whether Kirigakure still had the appetite to jump back into open war, or if they'd decide it wasn't worth the price. All he could do was wait and watch. As these thoughts churned in his mind, Elder Sano Nobuhisa cleared his throat to deliver the final orders. Over the coming days, maintain absolute vigilance. The moment we lower our guard is the moment the enemy strikes. Do not give them an inch of advantage. Every shinobi in the room exchanged determined glances, then saluted in unison. Understood, sir. With that, the meeting drew to a close. Outside, the village gate stood silent under a brooding sky, each sentinel poised, ready for whatever might come next. Nathan walked out of the meeting room without hesitation. Spotting an open courtyard beyond the gates, he quietly invoked the wind escape, wind wings technique. A pair of translucent, gale-swept wings fanned out behind him, lifting him high above the fortress walls. Once he was safely out of sight, he summoned several shadow clones to handle routine tasks before slipping even farther from the battlefield. At last, he disappeared into a quiet, uninhabited stretch of jungle and settled in for today's training. 5 days passed in a blur of solitary cultivation. On the 5th noon, deep within that same sparsely populated jungle, Nathan concluded a session of the palm immortal technique he'd been using to temper his body. He surveyed the half-dozen shadow clones standing at attention around him, then silenced them with a single thought, activating the shadow clone reabsorption. Bang, bang, bang. Each clone erupted in a burst of chakra-infused mist, fusing its memories and battle experiences back into Nathan's consciousness. He closed his eyes and sat perfectly still, mentally sifting through an avalanche of sensations, every sparring match, every failed attempt, every spark of progress. As the minutes ticked by, he organized those fragments, folding them into his mastery of each skill. 15 minutes later, Nathan opened his eyes. A newfound clarity shone in their depths. He had crossed an invisible threshold. His understanding had deepened, and his techniques were now sharper, more fluid. Rising to his feet, he felt the promise of yet another breakthrough on the horizon. Nathan paused for a moment, then lifted his hand and formed the seal. In the blink of an eye, he unleashed the ninjutsu. Earth-style, earth-flowing wall. A towering barrier of rock and soil sprang up before him, but Nathan barely noticed. Instead, he savored the smooth, effortless flow of chakra, the unmistakable thrill of performing a jutsu to absolute perfection. Focusing his mind, he called up his proficiency panel. As he'd hoped, after more than a week of relentless practice, Earth-style, earth-flowing wall had finally advanced. It jumped from level 6, 7,710,000, straight to level 7, 0. A triumphant smile touched his lips. This was only the beginning. Chapter 579, Promotion. Excellent. Nathan grinned as he examined the newly mastered escape and earthflow wall on his mission tablet. He'd anticipated that, once his spiritual attribute improved, his earth release, earthflow wall would rank up within a week, but seeing it actually happen still thrilled him. This promotion not only gave him another powerful jutsu to wield, it also granted an extra 30,000 chakra points each day. He'd planned to pour that newfound chakra into 4 techniques: wind release, vacuum jade, vacuum blade, wind bite, and water release, explosive water wave. After 5 days of non-stop practice, each skill had climbed to about level 3 proficiency, 350 out of 1,000 points. Gaining roughly 200 points per day felt slower than he'd hoped, but progress was progress. Over those same 5 days, Kirigakure had been surprisingly quiet. Skirmishes continued at the borders, but the overall intensity on the battlefield had dropped by several notches. Nathan checked his chakra reserves once more, excitement and determination burning in his chest. With his new daily chakra allotment, there was no limit to how far he could push these jutsu. Nathan found that he wasn't gaining much extra chakra at all, which inevitably slowed the rate at which his shuriken shadow clone technique and chakra feather cloak were advancing. And with no reliable way to replenish his reserves for the foreseeable future, he knew he needed a new approach. After weighing his options, Nathan resolved to divide his remaining 30,000 chakra points between those 2 skills. By allocating his energy in this way, he would earn 100 proficiency points a day in the Shuriken Shadow Clone technique and 150 points a day in the Chakra Feather Cloak. It wasn't a massive increase, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. Nathan's long-term plan was even more ambitious. Once he had perfected water release, water formation pillar, and water release, breaking wave, he would reallocate all his saved chakra into sharpening those 2 techniques. That shift would effectively triple their rate of improvement, and, given his limited resources, it was exactly the boost he needed. Nathan sat quietly, reviewing the chakra investments he'd planned for wind release, vacuum jade, and the other advanced ninjutsu. After a moment's reflection, he decided to hold off for another month. By then, his next physical transformation would boost his physique attribute, making any additional chakra allocation far more efficient. He inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly until his racing thoughts settled. When his mind was clear, Nathan activated the art of opening the mind. Instantly, he forged a mental link with his shadow clones, scanning the surrounding forest floor and treetops for any sign of danger. Finding none, he severed the connection. Without hesitation, he formed the precise seals of the shadow clone technique. A burst of violet smoke erupted around him, and 7 perfect duplicates materialized. Nathan wasted no time issuing orders. Each clone would drill the skills he'd assigned, some practicing fundamental taijutsu forms, others refining basic chakra control, before turning his attention inward. He began with the Palm Immortal technique, focusing all his will on reinforcing muscle and bone. Once his body hummed with newly tempered strength, he shifted to the Reflecting Heart technique, directing its subtle currents into the evolution of his Sharingan. Minute by minute, hour by hour, he pushed deeper into each form. Eventually, the last echoes of his chakra faded, and a hush fell over the forest once more. Nathan opened his eyes, feeling the quiet settle around him like a soft cloak, proof that his training had run its course for the time being. 2 days later, in the Grand Pavilion of the Blackstone Fortress, the delegations from Konohagakure and Iwagakure assembled for the formal signing of a peace accord. Nathan stood off to the side, watching the assembled shinobi and elders take their places. He remembered how, not long ago, a faction of Iwagakure ninja had attempted to seize the village, and even tried to assassinate Nara Shikaku and the other council members. If it hadn't been for Luosha's timely intervention and the rescue team she led, Konoha might have fallen into chaos. Yet here they all were, swords sheathed, masks laid aside, preparing to commit ink to parchment. Nathan couldn't help but reflect that such treaties often proved nothing more than fragile scraps of paper. Still, in moments like this, when tempers ran high and old grudges tempted open hostilities, a pledge of peace carried genuine weight. If Lord Onoki of Iwagakure ever tried to reignite the flames of war, Nathan was certain that many within the stone village would rise up, declaring that their hard-won reputation could not withstand another conflict. When the two leaders finally stepped forward, Lady Tsunade on behalf of Konoha and Elder Hanzo representing Iwagakure, Nathan held his breath. Each pressed their ink-stained seal into the treaty scroll. A hush fell over the hall as Hanzo pronounced the final words of the ceasefire. By this accord, both villages shall lay down arms and seek a path of mutual respect. Applause broke out, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Nathan allowed himself a small smile. The ceasefire was not a military alliance like the one Konoha had forged with Sunagakure. It was a simple armistice. That more limited scope explained why, in later years, Iwagakure shinobi never appeared at Konoha's Chunin exams. They had agreed to peace, not to partnership. As the crowd began to disperse, Nathan lingered by the long oak table where the scroll lay rolled. Luo Sha approached him, her expression both relieved and determined. "We did it," she said softly. He nodded. "For now, we did. But peace needs more than words. We'll have to earn it." She met his gaze and offered a firm nod in return. Outside the fortress, banners bearing Konoha's leaf and Iwagakure's stone fluttered side by side in the breeze. In that moment, Nathan believed they might just hold, if only everyone remembered why they chose peace in the first place. Nathan scanned the cheering crowd and quietly slipped into a secluded alcove. He raised his hands, wove the necessary seals, and unleashed his ninjutsu, wind release, wind wings. With a sharp whoosh of air, he lifted off and soared over the fortress walls, eyes fixed on the battlefield below. Right now, the stronghold was at its weakest, and Nathan couldn't afford any surprises. He needed to detect even the slightest stirrings of Kirigakure's shinobi hidden in the mist. Not out of some grand sense of duty, but simply because he preferred to keep things uncomplicated. True, he could harvest chakra from defeated enemies, but as his physical and mental attributes continued to grow, his daily chakra recovery rate was skyrocketing. Scavenging for chakra had become remarkably inefficient. Better, he thought, to maintain a quiet space where he could train undisturbed. To his relief, the tense calm persisted, not just today, but for days to come. Kirigakure remained locked in a protracted standoff, neither committing to a full-scale assault nor retreating entirely. The skirmish dragged on, each side waiting for the other to make the first critical move. And from high above it all, Nathan watched, ready for whatever came next. Nathan felt a familiar tangle of uncertainty in the air, almost exactly the same hesitation he'd seen from Iwagakure before. In his estimation, Kirigakure was still debating whether to end the war, and if so, how. That indecision had trickled down to the mist shinobi on the front lines, leaving them equally unsettled. But their doubts were ultimately inconsequential. With the sand and stone villages already withdrawn, the conflict's outcome had essentially been decided. Peace was inevitable. Even if the hidden mist stubbornly chose to press on, it would be a hollow victory. Before long, Konohagakure would redeploy its forces from the Rain Country front, and the mist would be forced to pull back of their own accord. In the gar and tide of political maneuvering, Kirigakure's moment of choice mattered very little. Time, as ever, flowed on. A week slipped away, and December arrived. That evening, Nathan completed another rigorous exercise with his shadow clones. He dissolved them one by one, drawing each clone's chakra back into himself. As he breathed deeply, he felt the familiar surge of power, and with it came the unmistakable sensation of advancement. His new technique, water style, water array pillar, had just reached the next level. Nathan closed his eyes and sank into calm reflection, letting the intricacies of the form settle into his muscles and spirit. Minutes passed. Then, with a determined breath, he opened his eyes, ready for whatever came next. Nathan paused for a moment, then formed a crisp sequence of hand seals. In an instant, he unleashed the water column jutsu. With a muted puff, a towering pillar of water sprang to life, roaring as it crashed through the jungle canopy and drenched everything in its path. Not bad, he thought, releasing the final seal and watching the mist disperse among the trees. With that technique mastered at the perfect level, Nathan added another powerful jutsu to his repertoire, and starting tomorrow, he'd receive an extra 30,000 chakra points to invest as he saw fit. He planned to split them evenly between his shuriken shadow clone technique and his chakra feather robe. By doing so, his daily proficiency gains in those skills would double, from 100 to 200 points for the clone jutsu and from 150 to 300 points for the robe. That kind of progress, Nathan decided, would keep him moving forward at a remarkable pace. Chapter 580, Counterattack. 15 days had slipped by like a breath, and the battlefield at Blackstone Stronghold remained eerily calm until the first contingent of reinforcements from Konohagakure thundered in. After more than 20 days marching from the rain country, the support troops had finally arrived, and fresh orders followed immediately. In the stronghold's war room, Captain Sano Nobuhisa stood before his assembled shinobi, arms folded, his face measured and serious. "These are the latest directives from headquarters," he announced. Every head snapped to attention. The air buzzed with a mixture of hope and tension. "Effective immediately, all outposts are to transition from defense to offense," Sano continued. "Our objective, to drive the Mist Ninja out of Fire Country as swiftly as possible and reclaim every inch of our territory." A ripple of chatter swept the room. Faces glowed with excitement at the prospect of action, yet behind those smiles lurked a flicker of concern. Many of them had been stationed here specifically to recapture Feiyu Town, a task that had proven tougher than anyone expected. Now the scope of their mission had suddenly grown far larger. "A counterattack?" someone finally whispered, half in disbelief. "Yes," Sano replied firmly. "Prepare your squads, we strike at dawn." Determination flared in every eye. After weeks of stalemate, the shinobi of Konohagakure, alongside Nathan, their latest Jinin prodigy, stood ready to turn the tide and take back their homeland. Nathan leaned against the rampart, watching the rising sun cast long shadows over the empty battlefield. Thanks to an unexpected surge of reinforcements from Kirigakure, their carefully laid plan had fallen apart, and Konoha's forces were now firmly on the defensive. Still, Nathan allowed himself a small, wry smile. At least they were alive, and for the first time in months could hold their heads high. His joy was tempered by the knowledge that launching a counteroffensive meant shattering the uneasy stalemate. Until now, neither side had dared make a truly bold move. That restraint was the only thing keeping the war from spiraling into all-out slaughter. But to reclaim Feiyu Town, they would have to strike, and that would undoubtedly provoke Kirigakure into retaliation. Nathan pictured the feared iron columns of enemy soldiers, still strong despite weeks of skirmishes. If Kirigakure simply weakened under sustained pressure, Konoha might prevail with only limited losses. But if they dug in their heels, if they resolved to fight to the death, Nathan knew the price would be paid in blood. The thought tightened his chest with dread. Around him, he saw familiar faces etched with the same conflict. Relief mingled with anxiety, hope shadowed by fear. Yet there was one undeniable truth lifting their spirits. This war was finally nearing its end. In the past 2 years, Konoha had been locked in combat with 3 rivals, Tsunagakure, Iwagakure, and Kirigakure. Tsunagakure had withdrawn months ago. Iwagakure had fallen back not long after. Now only Kirigakure remained. Nathan steadied himself against the chill morning air. The final showdown was inevitable. What mattered now was resolve, knowing that, when the time came, they would strike swiftly, decisively, and together. Only then could they bring the war to its long-awaited conclusion. Once the hidden mist village is driven beyond the Fire Country's borders, the Great War can finally be declared over, and true peace will follow. Skirmishes elsewhere, like the occasional clash with the Hidden Cloud Village, have never threatened our land. They're small potatoes compared to this. Nathan stood among the counselors, his face unreadable, as if their discussion meant nothing to him. In fact, it didn't, at least not yet. This was only his shadow clone. The real Nathan had barely set foot in the base for months, spending every waking hour either training or on his way to training, with little time to concern himself with politics or strategy. But that was before. When the clone returned with weight to the meeting's conclusions, Nathan's eyes sparked to life. There was no question now. He would join the counterattack. It wasn't merely Sano Nobuhisa's request. It was Nathan's own decision. 5 days ago, he had perfected his water-style wave break, elevating it to its flawless level 7 form, 00. Now, he was more eager than ever to test it. Nathan allocated the 30,000 saved chakra points equally between his Shuriken Shadow Clone technique and his chakra feather robe. That raised their daily proficiency gains from 200 to 300 points and from 300 to 450 points respectively, almost the maximum chakra he could muster in a single surge. Though this pace of improvement was respectable compared to most other skills, Nathan remained unsatisfied. The Shuriken Shadow Clone technique was an A-rank ninjutsu capped at level 9, demanding a staggering amount of proficiency. 300 points a day simply wouldn't get him to mastery anytime soon. And after his successive breakthroughs, especially the recent bond with the six-tailed beast, he'd gained a far deeper understanding of the tailed beast coat. Its potential now matched that of an A-rank ninjutsu, meaning it too required enormous chakra investments to reach its peak. In short, even dedicating 90,000 chakra points daily still left him short of the mark. The quickest solution was to secure additional reserves, and there was no doubt the upcoming counterattack would be his best opportunity to do just that. Nathan had calculated that, as long as he could siphon off enough chakra in the coming days, he'd make tremendous strides in both techniques. With that goal in mind, he left several shadow clones behind to continue their training, then took to the air and headed straight for the Blackstone stronghold, ready to join the counterattack. 5 days later, in a dense wood just south of the stronghold near Feiyu Town, Nathan crouched before a specialized shinobi of the hidden mist. He placed his palm against the man's chest, then abruptly pulled away. The ninja's body went limp, slumping to the forest floor with a dull thud. All at once, his chakra, spiritual energy, and physical vitality drained away into Nathan. Around them, several more mist shinobi lay collapsed, equally sapped of life. Raising his hand, Nathan wove a quick seal. "Fire release Sushoku," he intoned. 3 blazing orbs erupted from his palms, streaking forward to engulf the enemies. In moments, the shinobi were consumed by roaring flames, reduced to smoldering ash. When the last ember died, Nathan turned his head and spoke into the stillness. "You're here. Show yourself." A faint rustle of leaves answered him. Moments later, a lone figure stepped into view, clad in a flowing black robe, a mask concealing his face, eyes glinting from the shadows of the forest. Nathan's eyes narrowed as he took in the 4 jagged stripes etched across the mask, the unmistakable emblem of the hidden mist village. This was no ordinary shinobi, but an Anbu operative from Kirigakure. Nathan tuned into the intruder's subtle breathing, heart pounding with recognition. "Is that you?" he demanded. Under the mask, Hoshigaki Kasame's expression shifted, just slightly, before he answered coolly, "Do I know you?" Nathan didn't hesitate. He'd encountered this very presence before, the tailless Jinchuriki once driven by unmatched ferocity. Nathan's recent spree of relentless hunts had drawn Kirigakure's attention, and now they'd dispatched an Anbu elite to corner him, to prying for every scrap of information. But Nathan refused to give them the satisfaction. He studied the silent figure for a long moment, then let out a low sigh, disappointment flickering across his features. "You're not the real Kasame," he said quietly. "Just a shadow clone." There was a heartbeat of stillness. Though an Anbu shadow clone could be dangerous in its own right, it lacked the true power of the original. Confident in his deduction, and unwilling to be baited, Nathan turned away, slipping back into the mist as silently as he'd arrived, leaving the 4 masked shinobi standing alone. Even after pinpointing Nathan's location, his opponent didn't dare attack directly. Instead, he sent out a lone shadow clone. If Nathan hadn't encountered him before, and realized his chakra reserves far outstripped those of an ordinary shinobi, he probably wouldn't have noticed a thing. But once he'd been detected, why keep siphoning chakra from the scattered mist ninja patrols? Simple. He didn't care. The war was nearly over, and this was his last chance to stockpile as much chakra as possible. With every passing moment, his body drew closer to its next transformation, one that would heighten his physical prowess, expand his usable chakra, and further diminish his need for outside sources. So being discovered no longer mattered. At worst, he'd simply stop absorbing the moment it counted most.